What do you know the state of Wisconsin for? Cheese? Beer? What about the strange tall man that lurks in the woods and takes the heads of lost men? Haven't heard of that one, have you? This week on Unexplained Encounters, a story submitted by Driftless Daughter details her grandfather's bizarre rituals on his Wisconsin farm and what happens when those rituals are not adhered to. This disturbing story is titled Second Cutting. Keep your head. In the summer of 2009, I was 16 years old. I got sent to live on my grandparents' dairy farm in southwestern Wisconsin. They had a small operation of 40 cows milked twice a day by two people in their 70s out in the driftless hills southwest of Oroka. It was in one of those dead-end valleys the locals call coulees. The glaciers that flatten the rest of the Midwest missed that corner of the state. So instead of flat cornfields, it's steep wooded ridges and deep narrow valleys, like somebody crumpled up all the land, but never smoothed it back out. The roads follow the creeks. Cell service didn't work out there at all, and when my mother dropped me off that June, I lost my phone signal 20 minutes before I lost her taillights. I just remember thinking my life was over. My parents had split up that spring. There was no affair, no screaming, just they quit being happy with each other. The divorce meant the house would get sold, and that meant for one summer there was nowhere for me to be, while my mother moved us into an apartment in Madison. Her solution was her parents' farm. She pitched it to me. You'll have fresh air and time to think. But all I heard was exile. I cried the whole way down Highway 14, and my mother let me. She hugged me in the gravel driveway and told me she would call the landline every Sunday, and drove away. But, good news, it turned out to be the best summer of my life. It's also the reason I still sleep with something playing in my ears. Podcast, YouTube, you name it. But it's gotta be something. My grandparents were Earl and Dorothy. Grandpa Earl was 74 that summer, a chiseled old man. One of those old farmers who looked skinny until you watched him throw a hay bale one-handed, and he wore a seed cap so sweat-stained it had gone from red to a color I'm not sure I have a name for, but something between brown and reddish yellow. He wasn't much of a talker, and I don't mean that in a cold way. He was simply never the type to waste words. Grandma Dorothy was the opposite, 71 and sharp as a tack. And she ran the house and the books and had opinions on every little thing, and those opinions she would share at volume. Her favorite topic was my grandfather, who she had been married to for 52 years, and she always referred to him as your grandfather, in a tone that could land anywhere between proud and straight fed up. There was Duke, their farm dog, some kind of shepherd collie mix. He was 10 years old and gray around the muzzle, and the single most sensible creature on that property. The farm itself sat at the head of a dead-end valley. The gravel road followed the creek 2 miles past 3 other farms and ended at their place. Behind the house and barn, the valley kept going another half-mile, narrowing the whole way, and that backstretch was theirs too, a long triangle of pasture and hay ground running up to the wooded ridge at the end of the coulee. Everybody called it the Back 40. Though Grandpa told me once it was actually 36 acres. The creek came down out of those woods, except by July it wasn't a creek anymore, but a dry, stony ditch cutting across the valley floor like a line somebody had drawn. That was called the Dry Run. The first 2 weeks, I was a mess. I sulked and wore earbuds at the dinner table until Grandma removed them from my ears with 2 fingers, like she was picking ticks off a dog. She set them by my plate without a word, which was somehow worse than her yelling at me. Grandpa didn't try to talk to me at all, but he did assume that I would be helping around the property. So, the second morning, he knocked on my door at 4:45 and said, through the door, "Cows don't milk themselves." That was the whole speech. I'm not sure why I got up. Honestly, I think I was too surprised to refuse him. I stumbled down to the barn in the still dark, in my mom's old boots, which were somehow still in the mudroom from 1985, and Grandpa handed me a bucket of warm water He showed me how to wash a cow's udder before the milking unit goes on. And that was my job for days. Wash the next cow, move down the line. A milking barn at 5 in the morning in summer is one of the best places on this earth. It's warm, but not like a furnace, but a cozy warm created by 40 big animals putting off heat. And it smells like hay and molasses feed. I know that might sound bad to some, but it's not. It's super cozy. Every cow goes to her own stanchion. They know their spots better than kids in a classroom, and the milk pump runs its steady thumping pulse. Under all that, there's the radio. There was an old radio on a shelf up there, coated in 40 years of dust. There was an old radio on a shelf up there, coated in decades of dust and fly specks. It was tuned to an AM station out of La Crosse that played polka and farm reports. Saturday mornings it carried a call-in swap show where a man might spend 4 minutes describing a used hay rake. And it was always on. We'd finish milking and Grandpa would shut off the pump and the lights, but he always left the radio playing to an empty barn. All day, all night. I asked about it, still in my sarcastic phase. Do the cows like polka? He replied to me without even looking. Barn's never quiet. That's all. His tone said, never ask again, so I didn't. Maybe it was just old person weirdness. By the end of June, something had shifted in me. I couldn't have told you when it happened. The chores did it. Every adult in my life had been telling me hard work would be good for me, and I'd wanted to die every time they said that. But there's a thing that happens when you do necessary work that a living animal depends on, twice a day, every day, where your brain starts to quiet down. You can't spiral about your parents' divorce while you're pushing feed up to 40 impatient cows. The farm don't care about your feelings, sweetheart. And that turned out to be exactly what my feelings needed. I learned the cows first. Holsteins mostly, plus a few Jerseys Grandma called my little browns, and she spoiled them rotten. They all had names, often stereotypical names, but yeah, like Marigold. There always has to be a marigold in a cow herd. There was also Trouble, and she earned it. And Church, who once got loose on a Sunday and walked 1.5 miles down the valley. She was standing in the church lot when the 8 o'clock service let out. Cows seem to have personalities the same way people do. And by July, I knew all 40 by their udders alone, which is a skill I really never thought I'd have, and not something I would ever put on a resume. I learned the routine. We milked at 5 and ate breakfast after. Eggs from Grandma's own hens and bacon from a pig they'd bought off the neighbors. The Hilfigers, spelled the exact same as the clothing brand, but no relation. The middle of the day was field work. The big meal came at noon, and they call it dinner out here. Apparently that's a rural thing in these parts. Dinner at noon and supper at night. It took me half the summer to quit saying lunch. After evening milking and supper came the part I didn't expect to love, which was the hour when nothing happened. When Grandpa read the Farm Bureau paper in his chair, and Grandma worked on a crossword at the table, narrating her opinions about it. Duke would put his chin on my foot, and there was nothing to check and nowhere to be. After the first month, I stopped feeling that phantom buzz in my pocket and just, I don't know, existed. I've spent a lot of my adult life trying to get back to how those evenings felt, but I'm starting to believe it's something you only get out in those parts, with that kind of life. Now, my grandpa. He was the hardest of the two to figure out. He taught you things by handing them to you. He'd be fixing the sickle mower and just hold out a wrench, and that meant get in here and watch. And he would never say good job. You knew you'd done the calf feeding right because the next day it was simply yours to do. The first time he actually complimented me out loud was mid-July. I backed up the hay wagon into the shed on the first try, which steers backward from everything your brain believes, and he watched me do it, then said, "Well." Just, well. Grandma heard it and called over from her garden, "That's basically a standing ovation, honey. Don't let it go to your head now." Somewhere in the middle of all that, I fell in love with the whole place, with that whole way of living. It was the safest I'd ever felt anywhere. That ended up being the cruelest part, because there was something out there at the end of that valley. It didn't ruin one bad night for me. It creeped its way into all the good ones too. I'll get there. The salt came next, after the radio. Every Saturday evening after milking, Grandpa poured a full unbroken line of salt across the big sliding barn door track and the walk door. There was also a line across the bottom of the porch steps at the house, where it most likely looked like stained concrete. He kept it in an old Folgers coffee can on a shelf in the milk house, and he poured it very carefully and slowly. I was a city kid, so I assumed it was for like snails or slugs or something. But it was not for that. Then there were the Sunday walks. After dinner every Sunday, rain or shine, Grandpa walked the fence line of the back 40. Now, farmers do check their fences. That's normal. But I didn't think this was just checking the fence. He barely looked at the wire. He would walk the line slowly with the coffee can in one hand, and at certain spots and posts, not every post, certain ones, he would stop and pour a little salt at the base, pressing it down with his boot heel. The posts he salted weren't special that I could see. Some were old gray split cedar standing in a line of newer steel ones. And at the top corner of the back 40, where the pasture met the woods at the very end of the valley, there was a stone. It was square cut, about knee height, leaning, and the marks on its top face were worn too smooth to read. Grandpa would put his hand flat on it for a second, like he was touching a door frame before walking through. Then he'd pour the rest of the can out around it in a circle, before walking back down. There was also the mowing. Hay gets cut more than once a summer. The first cutting comes in June, and the field grows back for a second cutting in July. In a good year, you can take a third cut in September. Everybody in that valley followed that rhythm. Grandpa did too, on every field, except one. The back 40 got its first cutting in June, and then he would never touch it again that year. By August, that field would be past your knees, thick and going to seed. Real money just standing there in the sun, while Grandpa bought hay off Roy Hilfiger to make up the difference. Bought it. And when Roy delivered a load in early August, I would hear him say, grinning. And when Roy delivered a load in early August, I heard him say, with a grin, "You know, Earl, you got a whole field of this back there." And I heard my grandfather reply, "Yep." Roy quit grinning and looked off up the valley for a second. Then they started to talk about whatever. My grandparents had a rule that was never announced, but was enforced, that everybody be back inside by full dark. Sundown was fine, dusk chores are half of farming, but once that blue-black moment came when the yard light buzzed on, you were in the house. Grandpa was always the last one in. He'd stand on the porch a minute looking up the valley toward that back 40. Then he would come in and turn the porch light off. That was the day, over and done with. One July evening, I was out past the yard light catching fireflies in a jar. Nobody was watching. I thought I'd get away with it, but then I heard the screen door. Grandpa came to the edge of the light and said my name sternly. One time. Freaked me out enough that I walked back inside as fast as I could. Grandma thought every bit of it was ridiculous, and she let me know so. She mocked all of it, openly, cheerfully, for 52 years apparently. The salt especially. I was shelling peas with her on the porch one Saturday while Grandpa did his lines, and she nodded at him through the screen and said, "There he goes, seasoning the farm." She told me that when they married in 1957, his mother took her aside and told her the salting was the husband's job on this farm, and to not interfere. And Grandma said, and I quote, "I thought I'd married into people who worship the devil. Turns out they just worship sodium." But here's what took me years to understand about my grandmother. She mocked it, but she never stopped it. 52 years of jokes, and not once did she sweep a salt line away or serve supper late enough to keep him from his Sunday walk. She knew all of it and remembered all of it better than he did, because she talked about it. Everything I know about the lore of that valley I learned from a skeptic. She told me about Vernon Williams in the garden the first week of August, while we were picking beans. I'd finally worked up the nerve to ask why Grandpa wouldn't cut the back 40, and she laughed through her nose and said to me, "Because his father did, and his father didn't. And if you ask him, he'll tell you the ground's wet back there, which, it's not." Snap, snap, beans in the bucket. Then, in exactly the voice she used for telling me which neighbors watered down their cream 40 years ago, she said, "It got worse after Williams, of course. Everything got worse after Williams." "Who's Williams, Grandma?" "Vernon Williams. Farmed the next coulee over, the other side of that ridge." She pointed with a bean at the woods at the end of the valley. "Oh, this is 19 years back? 91, I think. He had a heifer get out in the fall, got up into the woods on the ridge. He went in after her toward evening, and never came back out. Now it is real steep in there, and they got a search up the next morning. The fire department and half the county walked lines through the trees. They found the old heifer first, standing down in a ravine and wouldn't move. They practically had to carry her back out. And they found Vernon, too, the third day. Sitting down, they said. Sitting against a tree with his hands in his lap like he was taking a rest." She stopped picking for a second, looked at the beans in her hand, and sighed, before saying, "And his head was gone." I remember how my eyes went wide then, and my pulse picked up a bit. "How was his head gone? What happened to him? What do you mean?" "Oh dear, it was gone," she said. "They never found his head. They looked, believe you me, they looked all fall, because you can't have quite the right funeral without the, head. The coroner ruled it was an animal. Coyotes, a bear come down from somewhere. Something scavenged him maybe after he died of a heart attack. That was the thinking. That's likely just what it was too. But of course the men around here couldn't leave it at just that. Your grandfather's generation. The older ones that were still alive then, they all got very quiet and very busy that winter, and a lot of salt was sold at the co-op that year. I can tell you, and Dolores Hilfiger told me her Roy started leaving the radio on in their barn too, which he'd always teased Earl about before. Men. They think it's something in the woods. Something that's always been in the woods that the old-timers knew about and walks the lines. And I'll tell you what I told Dolores. A bear doesn't carry a man's head off like a lunch pail, and neither does some boogeyman in the woods. Only a man can do a thing like that to another man. If it was anything but a bad heart and bad luck, had to be a person. That's worse than any story, if you ask me. That's why nobody wants it to be that. Too scary, the idea of having a person around who might cut your head off. So instead, there's a boogeyman in the woods, and we have to have the salt. There. Now you know as much as anybody around here. My grandmother was no fool. She was the least stupid person in the valley, and her version made the most sense to me. It still mostly makes sense. A county full of Norwegian and German farmers would rather believe in a woods thing with rules you can follow than a random death nobody can do anything about. She'd built herself a sensible account of her husband, and she lived in it comfortably. She got to stay comfortable for 52 years, precisely because he kept doing the things she mocked. She could afford not to believe, so long as the salt kept flowing. I asked her what the old-timers called it, that thing out in the woods. She rolled her eyes so hard I could hear it, then said to me, "Oh, honey, they don't call it anything. That's how you know it's men that made it up. Women would have at least given it a name." Then she straightened up with her hand on her back and looked for a second at the end of the valley. It was the middle of a sunny afternoon. Then we carried the beans in. That's what I mean about receiving a warning from a skeptic. She told me it was nothing. Every part of her told me it was nothing, except when she herself checked the way she eyed those mountains and those woods. August was a hot one. The creek had been down to nothing since July. Duke was the first one whose behavior actually started to scare me. Duke went everywhere on that farm all day, making rounds like he was the shift manager. But Duke would not cross the dry run. I'd noticed it vaguely all summer, the way he'd trail us on the Sunday walk as far as the crossing, then just sit in the grass, ears up, waiting until we came back. The first week of August, I decided to test him. I was 16 years old, and I had just heard that scary Williams story. So I walked across the dry run into the back pasture and called his name. Duke! Come here, Duke! Gotta be the best dog I ever knew. He minded you like a soldier. He walked to the very lip of that stony ditch and stopped like it was a wall of glass and started to whine. When I called again, sterner now, he did something I never saw before or after. He barked at me, twice, angrily, a tone I'd only ever heard him take against strange trucks. Then he walked 10 feet back toward the barn, sat down facing me, and waited for me to be sensible. I came back across, of course, and the moment I stepped over the dry run, he was all wags and apologies, pushing his head into my hands and glancing past me at the back 40 the whole time. I stood there scratching his ears with my heart going a little quick for no reason I could point to, and I remember actually saying it out loud to him, the stupidest sentence of my summer. I told him, "There's nothing back there, you big dummy." The cows agreed with the dog. You see, the back 40 was supposed to be grazing for the heifers, the young stock, but that August they wouldn't stay back there at all. Grandpa would move them across in the morning, and by afternoon they'd be bunched at the corner closest to the barn, and the grass would be there untouched. Yields were down in the milk barn too, which Grandpa blamed on the heat. It was hot, that's true, but I started noticing where the cows looked in the evening. Cows are always looking at something. They're prey animals after all. They keep watch. These cows at dusk all faced the same way, up the valley. 40 heads pointed at nothing except for a field of hay going unused. But the first time I saw it was August, the night before my mom's Sunday call. I spent that whole call the next day not telling her. The first real secret I ever kept from my own mother. It was dusk, milking just done, and I'd been sent to bring in a garden hose from behind the machine shed. So I was standing at the corner of the shed with the coil on my shoulder, facing up the valley. The driftless does this thing at dusk where the ridges go black before the sky does, so the valley becomes a bowl of last light with dark rims, and the back 40 sat at the bottom of it. And along the top of the field where the fence ran against the woods, I was looking at the fence posts, a row of little dark verticals against the pale grass. Sort of just my mind going anywhere else, so I was staring at something yet nothing. But there was a post between the posts, I noticed. It wasn't dramatic, just a dark vertical in the fence line like the others, except the spacing wasn't right. It stood where no post should be, and it was too tall, taller than a fence post by a couple feet at least, and thinner. I stood there telling myself it was a post they never pulled, or a dead sapling. And then, at 400 yards or more, the top of it moved. A small, slow tilt, like a head turning. Every hair on my body stood up, because obviously fence posts don't do that, but also because it didn't move like wind had pushed it. It moved like it had noticed I'd stopped walking and wanted to look at me. The yard light buzzed on behind me. That's how close to full dark it was, and the screen door banged. Grandpa came out onto the porch like he did every night, and I heard his footsteps stop. I was expecting him to call my name, but he didn't. He came off the porch and crossed the yard to me directly and stood next to me, looking where I was looking. By then, it was gone. In the few seconds I'd glanced toward the porch, the fence line had gone back to its right number of posts. Grandpa looked up at the valley a long time, apparently at nothing. At grass, I guess. then took the hose off my shoulder and said to me, "Inside, now." He didn't seem frightened. I never once saw my grandfather scared. That helped me to stay together, more than anything else. But he wasn't surprised either, and that's what kept me awake that night. Whatever I had half seen at the top of that field, my grandfather had not been surprised by it. I slept with my window latched, in August, in a farmhouse with no air conditioning. Down across the yard all night, I could hear the barn radio playing polka to all those cows. And for the first time all summer, I understood there was more meaning to that radio than I initially thought. I tried again the next day, while we were fixing a water line, both of us on our knees in a trench. It turned into the longest conversation about it we ever had, which I think is only because his hands were so busy, and nobody was looking at him. I said to him, "Grandpa, what did I see last night?" He cleared his throat, but stayed silent for a while. I wasn't sure he was even going to answer, until eventually he said, "Fence line." I replied right away, "But I saw something there, standing at the fence line." He was quiet again. He got the coupling seated, then he said, "It stands there sometimes, along about when the hay would come ripe." I went still, shocked. That was already more than I expected out of him. I made the mistake of flooding him with questions and he didn't answer one of them. He just let me run out. Then he said the thing I've remembered ever since. He said, "It was on this land before the farm was. My granddad's granddad cut hay for it before he cut any for himself, and we let the back field stand for it now. We keep to our side after dark, and it keeps to its side. That's all the understanding there is. It's not a thing you learn about. It's just a thing you put up with and respect." Respect. That was the word my grandfather picked. A man who barely talked, and he spoke of this thing like it was a neighbor. The worst neighbor in the world, I imagine. One you have to salt your doors against. But a neighbor all the same, with a boundary line and a deed older than the farm. Before we climbed out, I asked about the stone. He wiped his hands on his pants and said to me, "Survey marker. Government men set it when they cut the lines through here. Before statehood, even." He looked at me sideways and added, "First lines anybody ever cut through these hills. Crews dragging chains through the woods, marking corners. One of those crews came up this coulee." He sat up then, coughed a little bit, and cleared his throat once more. "Not all of them came back down." Then he picked up his shovel. That was the end of the talk. I went to the library in town, and I found one sentence. In an 1856 county history, in the middle of a paragraph praising the valley's timber, it said, "The first survey of this town was attended by difficulty, the chainman refusing to complete the eastern line, and the corner was set at a distance by compass sight. So they set the corner from far away, because the men paid to walk that line would not walk it, and that was the corner with the stone, the one I'd put my hand on." After that, I couldn't look at the place the same. Nothing on the farm was any different. The days stayed golden and the work stayed good. And if anything, I loved it there more, now that I knew what it was costing my grandfather to keep it that way. But I'd finally seen what the habits were for. The radio wasn't a habit. It was there so a human voice never stopped inside that barn. The salt lines got renewed every Saturday, because boots and weather slowly broke them down throughout the week, and I caught myself stepping over them carefully now, not scattering the grain anymore. In the evening, when Grandpa stood on the porch looking up to the valley, I understood he wasn't taking in the air. He was doing rounds. He had been doing rounds since before my mother was born, and nobody in 3 generations had thanked him, because when he did it right, Nothing ever happened. Nothing to thank him for. Well, not apparently. I saw it twice more that month, at dusk both times, and far off. Once at the fence line again, standing in the gap between two of the old cedar posts, the salted ones, and I'd swear it stood exactly centered between them, like it had measured them itself. And another time, the time that still gets me, not at the fence at all, but partway down the field, in the standing hay. The hay was well past your knees by then, and I could see too much of it above the grass. I never saw it close. Thank God for that. It stood taller than any man, with a thin body, with gray skin, the same gray as those old cedar posts it stood among, and it never moved while I watched. I'm not sure why. What did it want to do? What was its goal, just standing there and waiting? It almost always stood exactly on its side of every line. But then, it began to come down to the dry run. The last week of August, small signs began to show up on our side of the valley. On a farm, you know your ground like you know your own kitchen, and you notice when something's been moved. It started with Duke. He stopped making his rounds, and he pulled all his little patrols in close. He spent his nights on the porch facing up the valley, and some mornings he was hoarse. He had been barking in the night, alone, at nothing we ever saw or heard, until his voice wore out. So Grandma started letting him sleep inside, which she had sworn for a decade she would never do, and she made a joke about going soft, but no one laughed. Duke slept on the kitchen floor with his body against the door. Then it was the heifers. One morning, 3 of them were out, through a fence in the night, and not the back fence, the near one. They'd broken out of the safe pasture toward the barn, and we found them at dawn pressed against the barn wall, under the eave like cattle huddled against a windbreak in a blizzard. Except the night had been dead calm. The wire was pushed over from the pasture side. They'd apparently hit it running, and in a soft spot along the dry run, there was a mark. It wasn't any kind of footprint. It was a long, narrow pressure mark, deep at one end, like a heavy post had been set down there and leaned on, then picked up again. Grandpa stood over it, fixated on it. Then he hitched an old harrow to the tractor, which he pulled to smooth out dirt, and dragged that whole strip of ground flat. I know that he wasn't erasing it to just get rid of it, like it was nothing. He was removing it because Grandma walked that way to her raspberry patch. Then came the radio, and after that night I stopped sleeping right. It was around the end of August. My window faced the yard and the barn, and you could always hear the radio from my room, faint but there. A voice or an accordion under the crickets, and it was honestly a comfort, and it meant all was well. That night I woke around 2, and lay there, slowly understanding I was listening to the crickets and nothing else. No radio. I got up and looked out. The yard light was on and everything seemed normal. The barn was a big pale shape, and I stood with my forehead against the screen telling myself the station just went off the air, but also that old radios can die. Their tubes burn out. But then, even the crickets stopped. The whole valley suddenly, all at once, went quieter than I knew outdoors could ever get. And out of that quiet, the barn made a different sound. One long groan of wood under load. The sound a barn makes in a windstorm when it takes a gust broadside. One time, but there was no wind. I didn't wake anybody, and the best answer I can give you for why I didn't was that I was a kid. A scared one at that. I stood at the window until the crickets came back, and at some point after that, the radio faded back in mid-polka, which is not what a burned-out tube does. I got back in bed, laying there stiff as a board, until Grandpa's alarm at 4:45. At milking the next morning, I told him everything I'd heard. He didn't stop milking, but when it was done, he did something I'd never seen him do. He got the coffee can on a Thursday and re-poured every line. And that Sunday, he carried the can and a spade. And at the old cedar posts, he didn't just pour salt. He cut a little trench post to post and filled it, a buried line clear across each gap. I helped him, and we didn't talk much. The woods were maybe 80 yards off, full of August shade, and I've never in my life felt so watched. Duke sat at the far side of the dry run the whole time, watching us from as close as he dared to come. On the walk back down, Grandpa said something. He said, "Hay's overripe." And I looked at the back field. All that standing grass gone heavy-headed and started to fall over in patches. I said, "Is that bad?" He replied, "It's never stood this late. I mulled that over in my mind for years before I got it. Other summers, that field got used. By late August, there'd be trails pushed through the grass and pressed down places the size of a truck where the hay lay flat, like a deer bed but bigger. And by fall, the whole field looked grazed off, though nobody ever saw an animal in it, and nobody ever cut it. That was the deal. The field was the rent, and every year the rent got taken. That summer, the field stood perfect. No trails, nothing pressed down, the whole crop standing there going to waste into September. Whatever it was no longer taking what was left out for it, and it had started coming down to look at us instead. Even at 16, I could tell what was happening. Everything my grandfather did was still holding, and that thing up the valley. It was testing the perimeter, sometimes getting through. There was a thunderstorm on the 3rd of September. That was my last week. School would start after Labor Day, and my mom was coming Saturday to get me. I was heartsick about leaving. I never would have believed in June that I would feel that way. The whole day felt like storm weather. It was hot, swampy, and green-skied. The radio would interrupt the music to talk about severe thunderstorm watches for Vernon and Crawford counties. At supper, the phone rang. Grandma's sister Helen over in Westby had fallen and was in the ER in Baroka with a hip that they thought was broken. Grandpa did not like leaving his farm. I watched him stand at the window looking up the valley at the storm light while Grandma got her purse. I heard him say, "I don't like it." And Grandma replied, "Earl, she's my sister." They figured they'd be back by 10. Milking was already done and the storm was supposed to pass south. I was a teenager, not a toddler, so they let me stay. Grandpa stood in the doorway with the truck keys. He told me to keep the doors locked and leave the porch light on, that Duke would stay inside. Then he gave me the same look he'd given me in the trench, and he said, "You don't go outside. Whatever you hear. If there's trouble, phone the Hilfigers." "Okay, Grandpa," I told him. The storm didn't pass south. It came up the valley around 9, and coulee storms are an event. The thunder gets caught between the ridges and rolls back and forth, like someone moving barrels around upstairs. And the rain hit the house sideways. Duke had himself pressed flat against the kitchen door, shaking like a leaf. At 9:20-something, the lights browned and came back, and then went out for good. The yard light died with them, causing the whole valley to just disappear into the void. Outages weren't rare. I knew the drill. So I got the flashlight from the mudroom and stood in the kitchen listening to the rain. It took me a full minute to hear what I wasn't hearing. The radio was off too. That very same moment I realized that, from across the yard through the rain, came a sound I knew with my whole body after a summer of milking. It dropped my stomach right through the floor. One of the cows was mooing, screaming really. And if you've been around cattle, you know that's different from regular mooing. This was distress, over and over from the barn, and I knew exactly which animal, because we had exactly one animal due. A first calf heifer Grandpa had put in the box stall that very evening, because he didn't like how she'd been acting. It was Marigold, one of the fourth or fifth ones named Marigold, Grandma's little brown with the white smudge on her forehead. That was the heifer I'd halter broke myself in July, who followed me around her pen like a big anxious dog. And she was calving 10 days early, in the dark now, in the middle of a storm. There I stood in that kitchen, behind a locked door I'd promised to keep locked, while an animal I loved was in trouble 60 feet away across open darkness. Somewhere out in that dark, at a distance I had no way to judge, was the neighbor. I called the hill figures first. The line was dead, unfortunately. The storm had taken it down, or it went out with the power. And Marigold out there kept on screaming, rawer this time, and I thought about what might happen to her and her calf with no one there. You could lose them both in an hour. I thought about telling my grandfather I just stood in his kitchen and listened. Is that what he would do? What he would be proud of? I didn't think so. So I grabbed a lantern from the mudroom, and I put on his barn coat because it was closest, and it smelled like Grandpa, like hay and machine oil, and I think that helped me to get across the yard as much as the lantern did. Anyway, Duke stood at the door with me. I asked him, "You coming?" That dog looked up at me, then at the door, and lay down on the floor with his ears flat. And he gave me a whine. That dog was scared, and I wasn't sure if it was the storm. It was then I was beginning to think that that yard was not empty. I went anyway. The whole plan was to get to the barn, bar the door behind me, and wait for headlights with Marigold. I opened the kitchen door and the rain was already slacking, and the thunder had rolled off down the valley, so the lightning came late and low behind the ridges. I put the flashlight beam on the barn door 60 feet away, and I didn't sweep it around the yard. I did not want to see who or what else was out there with me. I had only one goal, one destination, and that was all I needed to see. In my head, I thought, if I didn't see something, it couldn't see me, so I could just keep walking. So I kept the beam on the door and just walked. The crickets had stopped. So had the frogs down at the creek. And about halfway across from up the valley, from some distance the dark made impossible to judge, one strand of fence made the sound wires make when something presses it down to step over. That low singing twang, then the softer sound of it coming back up. God, I wanted to run then, but I kept myself from doing it. It wasn't because I kept my head. My legs had gone so weak that walking was the best they could do. That's how scared I was. I got to the barn door. I saw that the salt line in the track had washed to a sodium slush. I rolled the door back and got inside, rolling it shut behind me and dropping the bar. I stood in the dark of that barn, with those dozens of cows breathing around me. Every single one was on her feet. If you don't know, cows lie down at night. They stand up when something is wrong. There were 40 animals in there, standing in the dark without a sound, every head turned toward the far end of the barn, the end that faced up the valley. Marigold was down in the box stall in the light of my lantern, and the calf was coming. It was coming right, thankfully, 2 little hooves and a nose, a textbook birth. She just needed time and calmness, when neither of us currently had any. I got in there with her, and I got her head in my lap like I'd seen Grandpa do with a downed cow. I talked to her, low and steady, half instructions I was remembering out loud, and half nonsense. At some point I understood I wasn't only talking for her. The radio was dead, and my voice was the only human voice in the valley. So for both our sakes, I dared not stop. But it came to the barn while the calf was being born. Things were finally moving with Marigold when I heard, over her, the fence at the near pasture. That same twang and release, close now, followed by nothing for a while. But then there were footsteps. I know what I heard. The steps were slow and too evenly spaced, yet too far apart. Each one landed flat all at once, like somebody setting the end of a heavy post down in the wet gravel over and over. It went along the barn wall away from me, one slow, flat step at a time, and every cow in that barn swung her head to follow it, but not one of them made a sound. At the far end, it stopped, and it knocked. There were 3 slow knocks on the boards, way up high on the wall, higher than the hay-mow door, each one heavy, and it wasn't testing the wall. I think it was letting me know it was there. The whole barn frame carried it down to me through the beams. Marigold pushed, and I heard myself get louder, and what came out of me wasn't a prayer. I recited the milking order, all 40 cows, stanchion by stanchion, starting with church at the front of the barn and going stall by stall toward the back. My voice shook so hard, the names came out in pieces. But they came out, and I kept them coming, because it was the one thing I knew by heart, start to finish. Calves come all in a rush at the end, so there she was, a wet heifer calf in the straw all of a sudden, and Marigold turned around and began to lick her baby. The calf sneezed and shook her little ears. The rest of the barn was quiet. I didn't even know when the footsteps and knocking stopped. I lay in the straw with my back against the boards and listened, and a ways off, headed up the valley, the fence sang once more, far away. Moments later, the crickets came back, just a few at first, and eventually all of them. About 20 minutes after that, light swung across the barn windows, headlights in the yard, and I heard the truck doors. I heard my grandfather shout my name. He sounded worried, the closest to scared I'd ever heard him, but not actually there. And I'm sure it's because he found a dead dark house and an unbarred kitchen door. When he got to the barn door and his flashlight found me, sitting in the straw in his coat with Marigold and a live calf, the relief and fear went across his face at the same time. He came in the stall and looked the calf over, then at Marigold. After that, he looked at me. Whatever he saw on my face, I think he knew then, as he asked only one question. "How close did it get?" "The wall," I told him. My grandfather sat down in the straw next to me, at 74 years old in his church pants, and he put his arm around me. He had never done that before. We sat there against the boards together while Grandma stood in the doorway holding Duke by the collar. Nobody said a word about the promise I'd broken, that night or ever. Grandpa stayed in the barn until morning. I was inside, watching him from the window when I could. Grandma would not let me stay out there, and after the power came back around midnight, the yard light came on. There was my grandpa, setting a kitchen chair inside the open barn door with the radio going louder than usual. He had the coffee can on the floor beside him, and he sat there till dawn. The next morning, over breakfast, he talked more than I've ever heard him talk before or since. He didn't have answers. Nobody in that valley had answers to this. Just the stories that had been handed down to him. His granddad's granddad had made the arrangement his first summer on the claim, after a winter he wouldn't describe at his own kitchen table, and the survey stone was already old in that corner when he did it. There had been hay standing for it every fall since, and each son got told at 18, or whenever the farm passed. He'd seen it 4 times in his life, every time in a dry August, and his father had told him the dry years were when respect mattered most. Because, and this was when Grandpa word for word said, "A dry year, everything comes down to the creek." Grandma sat through all of it with her coffee and for once did not mock and did not argue. At the end, she got up and squeezed my shoulder on her way to the sink. I heard her tell the window, "Well, I still say only a man could do what was done to Vernon Williams. But you'll notice I never once swept up your grandfather's salt." 2 days later, Grandpa hitched up the haybine, driving it across the dry run, and cut the back 40. September 5th, the second cutting, 2 months late. He cut it alone and he raked and baled it. But he didn't sell it, and he didn't feed it. Instead, he hauled every bale of that to the top corner and stacked them by that survey stone, a neat square stack like a little house, and left them there. It was the rent, but more like the rent laid out on the table and pushed towards the person it was meant for. When my mom's car came up the driveway that Saturday, the stack was the last thing I saw of the back 40, sitting there in the corner by the trees. The calf, by the way, we named her Storm, breaking about 4 generations of flower naming tradition. And Grandma allowed it because, she said, I'd earned 1 vote and I'd wasted it on that. I went back every summer through college, and it all held. Duke lived to be 14 and never crossed that dry run once. Grandpa kept his rituals, his respect, another 9 years. And when his hips finally couldn't walk the fence, I walked it, with him riding the 4-wheeler alongside me, telling me which posts. I learned to pour those salt lines slow and even, pressing the salt down with my heel. Grandpa died in 2018 in his own bed, and I think that's how every farmer hopes to go. I swear half the town came. Roy Hilfiger stood at the graveside and said to me quietly, "Your grandpa really took care of things up that valley." He then shook my hand. Grandma sold the cows that spring but kept the land, leasing the fields to a cash crop operation out of Richland Center. Nice enough folks with big equipment. I was there at her kitchen table the day the young manager stopped in to ask why the field at the head of the valley was excluded from the lease. "Prime ground," he said, "just sitting there." I watched my grandmother, 80 years old then, and a skeptic her whole life, look that man in the eye and say, "That field's wet." It's not wet. And when he pushed on it, just a little, she said, "It goes to my granddaughter and she's particular." That was the first I'd heard of it. She held my eyes across the table while she said it, and I understood I was being handed the coffee can. So, the farm will be mine outright when Grandma goes. She's 88 now, and mean as ever, Godkeeper. I live 2 hours away, and I'm there most weekends. My husband thinks I'm sentimental about fence lines. My daughter thinks the Sunday walk with the salt can is a game her mother invented. And for now, that's fine. She's 7. There's time. The first cutting comes off that back field every June, and every June I stack it in the corner by a stone that men refused to walk to 180 years ago, and the second cutting stays standing. On August evenings, when the light goes silver and the ridges go black, I stand on that porch where my grandfather stood, and I look up the valley. Some years, some dry years, at the top of the field, the fence line has 1 post too many. I count them, and I give that extra one a nod. Then I go inside and turn on the radio. I like to think we have respect for one another, it and I. Well, that story wasn't all that scary. Sometimes your rural neighbors might be tall and thin and pale, and they just want to come over to see if your new calf is doing okay in the middle of a thunderstorm in the middle of the dark. Nothing crazy about that. And obviously he was anxious because he knocked 3 times and left. Can't blame the guy. That's what I'm gonna believe so that I can sleep tonight. Good night. Thank you all so much for tuning into this episode of Unexplained Encounters. I've been your host, Darkness Prevails. You can find me on X at Dark Prevails, and you can support the show by listening on Erie.fm. Sign up to be a premium member there, and unlock bonus stories, members-only shows, and premium-only audiobooks, and more. Till next time, everyone, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.
Hi, welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
Yo, unless I've gone completely senile, and that might be the case, let's be real, I'm aging faster than Asmongold, I think this is our 200th episode. So thank you all insanely much for sticking with me for 200 whole episodes of me never figuring out how to shut up. You're all the best. Quick warning though, I had a hankering for some school-related stories on this one, and I feel like school is kind of like work for people who don't have a career yet, so it counts. Anyway, prepare for skinwalkers, a glitch at Aldi, and extremely haunted schools. These are tales from the break room. And you should leave us a review or follow us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Thank you. Ghost at my law school. From Bobwar, Wasabort. A few years ago, I attended law school in LA. I'd heard rumors it was haunted when I first started. And as a believer in the supernatural, I tried to stay away from spots at the school where people had seen spirits. I've encountered ghosts and what I'm sure was a demon before, making me wary of what people report as ghosts. While at school, I had multiple encounters with an entity that called herself Sharon, as well as other spirits. The first was late at night in the school's library. The library had 3 floors with a basement, ground, and second floor. I tried to stay on the ground and second floors, as the basement always scared me. It was designed in a way where if you whispered just right, it would always sound like a person was right next to you. It was also where one of the 2 restrooms was. I left my study group to use the restroom. When I got into the basement and turned the corner to the restroom, I saw a woman in an old vintage red dress. She reminded me of a secretary for some reason. She walked down the hall, and as I was curious who she was, I followed her. That hallway ended with a wide open room filled with corrals and a dead end, with the only way out being behind me. When I got there, she was nowhere to be found. And I know for a fact I had not seen her come back down the hallway towards me. While I was walking around, I asked out loud, "Who's there?" I could feel something, and something whispered back, "Sharon." I left that basement so fast, my study group was confused as to why I was packing up like a madman. For the next 3 years, I only went into that basement whenever the sun was out. I'm also sure the woman I saw was not Sharon, but that's for later. The second encounter I had was on the second floor of the library, funny enough. My friend, I'll call her Elle, and I were getting ready for exams. We were in the library near closing. The second floor had a hallway of study rooms that were quite popular. All night I'd walked up and down, seeing who might still be there. We were in the last study room on our side of the hall, and by this point, there was no one else around. At closing, the lights to the rooms automatically go off, and when they did for us, we began to pack up to leave, as we both lived on campus. We were pretty spooked already, since it was darkish and no one was around. When I opened the door, we both heard what sounded like children laughing and playing. Elle told me, "Run," and we did. As we ran, we heard this loud thud above us, which was odd, as there was no other upper floor on this side of the building. We looked at each other as the sound kept going, and we heard a man yell before the last thud on the roof. We ran all the way to the stairs, and by the time we hit the landing halfway to the ground floor, I could feel something watching us. I told Elle then, "Whatever you do, don't look back." I had no idea what was behind us, but I had the strangest feeling it was a woman. All I knew was if we did turn to look, we would not like what we saw. The librarian saw us running out the door, but looked as if it wasn't the first time it ever happened. After that, Elle and I never studied till closing again. The last major encounter I had was during finals of my first year. Like I said, I lived on campus, and I was close with a lot of the other students who did as well. I had an open door policy where no matter what time it was, people could stop by. And many did, like Elle or another friend I'd grown close to. One night I was woken up by my doorbell. All the apartments had these obnoxiously loud bells that filled the room. It was unmistakable. I looked at my phone and saw it was 3 a.m. I was confused, but thought maybe Elle or my other friend were up late and were freaking out over our first exam that week. When I looked through the peephole, there was no one there. That should have been my first clue. When I opened the door, I had the distinct feeling of someone walking past me. I thought it was strange, but I've never been so wrong in my life. When I sat on my bed, I experienced something I'd only encountered one other time, when I had run into what I was sure was a demon. My vision split. I was looking through my eyes and the eyes of another person, but from the corner of my room. Something was looking at me. I could feel her anger and hatred, and it was focused directly on me. I could then see a woman in all white with long black hair staring at me, but also I could see myself on the bed. I was terrified, almost rooted in place. I was raised Catholic, and I kept a rosary on my nightstand. In that moment, the part of my brain not paralyzed by fear willed my hand to grab it, and I began to pray. I've prayed 1,000 times in my life, but this time I felt as if I was praying for my life. A part of me knew this was Sharon. It was familiar somehow. I prayed for 30 minutes. The whole time I felt as if I was in a tug-of-war with Sharon's will. At some point, she vanished, and my vision returned to normal. I felt exhausted though, but I was too scared to fall asleep. I don't remember falling asleep, but I know that I woke up to my doorbell again. When I looked this time, it was my friend, Kay, at the door. I let her in, but when I looked down, there was a bare footprint on my door seal. The outlines of toes were unmistakable, and Kay saw them too. They weren't there the day before. My parents came by that day, and I believe my mother and I share this ability to sense the supernatural. When she walked into the apartment, she looked at me like something was off. When I got a moment to speak to her alone, she asked if something had been in my apartment, and I told her yes. The next 3 years, I had multiple other smaller encounters with Sharon, but nothing like that night. I've only been that scared on 2 other occasions with the supernatural. I still have that rosary within reach of my bed years later, and it will stay there until I pass on to the next life. Something lives in the fields around my campus. From Danny D123. I've lived in Michigan my entire life. I grew up in the Metro Detroit area, went to high school in Saginaw, and now attend a small college in southern Michigan. I'm going to keep the name of the school itself private for the sake of anonymity. It's a small college, fewer than 2,000 students, sitting smack dab in the middle of nowhere. The closest major city is about a 45-minute drive away, and getting to campus means passing endless farm fields and small towns that don't offer much more than a Dollar General and a blinking yellow light. I don't mind this change of pace though. I've lived in the suburbs and city my whole life, so it's been fun for me to live in a rural area for a change. The town is quiet, and the campus is beautiful in many ways, especially in the winter when the snow is falling. Because of where the college is located, wildlife regularly wanders through campus. Deer are the most common larger animal that comes through, and they've become so used to the students that you can walk within a few feet of them without them even lifting their heads. Most of the area's wildlife is harmless. Most of it, but not all. The first time I saw this creature, I was walking back to my dorm from the library late into the night. It was after 1 a.m, and the library had just closed. The snow was falling lightly, just enough to blur the edges of everything. My dormitory was located on the very edge of campus, about a 10-minute walk from the library. Beyond it were open fields, a patch of forest, and a small park owned by the college far off in the distance. As I walked along the sidewalk, beginning to wish I'd brought a heavier jacket, I glanced down the road toward my dorm. At first, I saw nothing out of the ordinary, only the snow-covered fields and the dull glow of a distant streetlight. But when I looked again, something was stepping out of the trees under the streetlight. At first, I assumed it was a dog of some sort. It looked like one from that distance. Maybe it was a stray or a farm dog that had gotten loose. But as it stepped fully into the light, I realized something was very wrong. It was enormous, larger than any dog I'd ever seen, and the way it moved wasn't right. It seemed to crawl on all fours, but not in the way a dog would. That was because whatever this thing was did not have regular front paws. What it had instead looked like oversized, heavily furred human hands. That was enough for me. I sprinted toward my dorm, slipping on the frozen ground, but managing to reach the door in record time. I never heard anything chase me, but I didn't look back. As far as I know, that creature never noticed me at all, but I wasn't going to sit around and wait for it to do that. For a while after this event, I tried explaining away what I'd seen. I told myself it was just exhaustion from studying, that the snow and darkness had distorted my vision, that it had been a normal, but oversized dog. However, nothing I came up with fully settled. Deep down, I knew what I'd seen could not be explained. But eventually, classes and exams pushed the memory of the encounter aside. Midterms turned into finals, and before I knew it, the semester was over. The next time I saw the creature was during the first semester of my sophomore year. It was still early in the semester, but classes were getting difficult. I was studying in my dorm room on the 3rd floor. From my window, I could see the wide field behind the building. Looking out, I saw a group of deer packed tightly together at the far end of the field. Something shot out across the field and caught my attention. I knew instantly what it was. The creature was sprinting across the field at an unnatural speed. It launched itself at one of the deer, which barely had any time to react. It slammed into the deer, tearing into its side with powerful jaws. Then, as if the deer weighed almost nothing to it, the creature lifted the thing off the ground and carried it off into the trees. I sat at my desk long after it was gone, frozen with fear and bewilderment. After that, I avoided the edges of campus at all costs, as much as I possibly could, especially after dark, which wasn't easy given the campus's small size. I even considered switching dorms to a building closer to the center of campus. But in the end, I stayed where I was, not wanting to leave my friends and the nice room I had. A month after that, I had my third and final encounter. I was driving home for the weekend, but due to an on-campus event, which ran later than expected, the sun had already set. As I drove down the road leading away from campus, I noticed something lying in the left lane. As I got closer, I realized it was a deer. This deer, however, had not been hit by a car. Deep gouges had been torn through its side, as if massive fangs had ripped the flesh to ribbons. I slowed down, got over to the other side of the road, and passed it, feeling uneasy. Then I checked my rearview mirror. Standing in the middle of the road, beside the mutilated deer, was the same creature. This time, I could see it clearly. It had to be 8 feet tall. Black and gray fur covered a heavily muscle-bound body. Its mouth was full of long fangs, dripping with what looked like blood. And it wasn't on all fours. It was standing upright on 2 legs, watching me. I floored it. I don't know why it didn't chase me. It easily could have. I'd already seen how fast it could move. Instead, it just stood there, staring as I sped away. I never saw it again. Whatever it was, it never seemed all that interested in me, thank God. I'm very grateful for that. Still, knowing something like that exists somewhere near where I live keeps me awake some nights. It's been nearly a year since my last encounter. Whether it left the area to find new hunting grounds or is still roaming the fields around my college, I'm not sure. But I won't be upset if I never have to see it again. The Original Inhabitant, from Creek Peeper 22. I stopped telling this story out loud because people always want me to turn it into a joke. I can't do that without feeling stupid. I can still picture one part of it too clearly, and once you see something like that, it sits in your head for a very long time. In 2012, I was a sophomore at a college in Oregon. That fall, it rained all the time. The dorm I lived in was one of those older brick buildings that had been quote-unquote updated a dozen times without ever really feeling modern. The carpet was always damp, and the air always smelled faintly of detergent because the laundry room was in the basement, and the vents never did their job quite right. The building was 4 floors with a basement. The layout was simple. One long hallway on each floor, doors on both sides, a lounge near the stairwell, vending machines at the far end. You could hear everything through the walls. So most nights, you would hear someone's music, people in the hallway, the occasional argument, and somebody laughing out loud. There was also the story everybody knew by the second week. They called it the Walker, though I've also heard it called the Surveyor. Depends on who you talk to. The actual details change here and there, but the core of the story is always the same. Late at night, you would hear slow footsteps in the hallway when no one was there. Sometimes you would hear them above you, even when you were on the top floor. Sometimes the steps would stop outside a door for a long time. People claimed they could feel when it was outside their door. I didn't take this seriously. I'd lived in enough old buildings to know they make noise. Could be pipes clicking or floors settling. People act weird in dorms because they're tired and half drunk and want a story. The only part of the legend that stands out to me was what older students would say when they got quiet. They would say it wasn't a dorm ghost. They would say the land had history and the building set on something the school never talked about. They never had a solid explanation as to what that was, which was part of what made it stick for me. It was just vague enough, so anybody could fit it to whatever they already believed. But I filed it away as dorm nonsense, until late one Friday night. A bunch of us ended up in my room because my roommate, Ethan, had a bottle, and we were bored. It was raining hard enough that you could hear it through the window, even with the music turned up. There were 8 people in a room built for 2. We had a laptop going with a playlist. We had cheap cups. Nobody was trying to be deep, and it was just one of those nights. Someone suggested Truth or Dare, because we were 19, and we were out of other ideas. It started out dumb and normal. Text somebody, do a shot, go ask the RA something stupid. People were laughing. It was loud enough that someone 2 doors down yelled at us through the wall. Then Nicole, who lived on our floor, said we should do a dorm dare. She said it like she was proud of herself for thinking of it. She asked if we'd heard the story about the 4th floor and the service hallway. Everybody had heard some version, but I hadn't heard all the details. Nicole said that there was an unmarked door on the 4th floor near the vending machines. Behind it was a narrow hallway used by maintenance. At the end, there was a metal door that was usually locked. The dare was to go there, knock 3 times, then ask, "Is anyone walking tonight?" I remember laughing, saying that sentence sounded ridiculous out loud. A couple people laughed at me, but Nicole did not. Ethan did, and that was the problem. Ethan loved dares. He loved being the guy who did the dumb thing first. So he said he would do it. I told him we were not doing that, but he said we were. 2 other people said they would come too, which made it feel safer. I ended up going because I didn't want Ethan going off with a couple of half-drunk guys to the 4th floor. We left the room and the hallway noise dropped behind us. The dorm at night always felt different once you stepped out of a loud room. The lights made everything look washed out. The carpet was darker in the center where people walked most. You could smell wet shoes. We took the stairs up, 3rd floor, then the 4th. By the time we hit the 4th floor landing, the air felt colder. I noticed it right away. Ethan didn't say anything, but he slowed down. The 4th floor hallway was empty. No doors down, no voices, no TV noise. It wasn't dead silent because you could still hear the building, but it felt closed off. The vending machines at the end made their usual sounds. Nicole had described an unmarked door. There it was, beige like the walls, so I'd probably walked past it before without even noticing or caring. There was a faded sign on it that said, "Authorized personnel only." Ethan went over, pushed it, and it opened. Inside was a narrow cinder block hallway. Pipes ran along the ceiling. A single bulb in a wire cage lit the middle of the hall. The air smelled off, like mud. It didn't smell like a typical basement. It smelled more like dirt after rain. At the end was a flat gray metal door. No window, just a plate and a keyhole. Ethan turned, then grinned at us. But his grin looked a bit nervous. He went ahead and knocked 3 times. The knocking echoed down the hallway and came back in a way I didn't like. The sound felt bigger than the space should have allowed. Then Ethan said the line, "Is anyone walking tonight?" Nothing happened for a second. I almost relaxed. I nearly felt stupid for being so tense about it. But then we heard a footstep. It sounded like it was above us, which made no sense as we were on the 4th floor. Then I realized it wasn't above us, it was behind us, in the service hallway, coming from the direction of the door we had just used. Another step, then another. Slow steps, close enough that I could tell it was not the usual building noise. It sounded like someone putting their full weight down on each step. One of the guys whispered, "Stop it." He sounded scared. Nobody had done anything, though. Ethan took a step backward until his shoulder hit the metal door. I could see his throat moving when he swallowed. The footsteps kept coming. They didn't speed up, nor did they slow down. I turned to look down the service hallway toward the door we came in through. But it was empty. There was nowhere someone could hide. It was just a straight hallway. The light did not reach the doorway well, but I could still see the outline. Nobody was there. The footsteps stopped about 10 feet behind us, and the air grew freezing cold. It felt harder to breathe, not because I was choking, but because my body was trying to stay quiet. That's when the bulb in the wire cage flickered and went out. Ethan pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam was shaky. It lit up the cinder block walls and the pipes. That's when I saw the handprints. They were on the wall to our left, wet and dark. They weren't dusty. They had edges. You could see finger shapes. They started at about waist height and continued upward in a staggered line, higher than any of us could reach without standing on something. Ethan whispered, "No." From the metal door in front of us, we heard a scratch. It sounded like nails dragging slowly across paint. Ethan stepped away from the door so fast that he nearly hit me. He swung the flashlight beam around, and it caught more wet marks on the pipes. Then, on the ceiling. I stood there staring at the ceiling, because my brain could not accept what I was seeing. The scratch came again, longer now. Then a voice spoke from behind us. It was quiet, but it wasn't far away. It was close enough to make my skin tighten, and it sounded exactly like the words, "You asked." Nobody moved for a second. Then Ethan grabbed my sleeve and pulled. We turned toward the exit door and started walking fast. We didn't run, and that wasn't bravery. It was fear. None of us wanted to make a mistake that felt like breaking a rule. When we hit the service door and pushed back into the normal hallway, the lights were on and the vending machines were humming. It should have felt normal, but it didn't. Wet footprints had appeared on the carpet outside the service door. Bare footprints. These were not normal. The toes were much too long. The stride between them was too long for a person walking at a normal pace. The prints went straight toward the stairwell door, which was about 20 feet away. Then they did something I still don't know how to explain. They continued up the wall beside the stairwell door. The wet marks went vertical, climbing from the carpet up the painted wall. The last print was near the ceiling, right at the corner where the wall met the ceiling tile. Then they stopped. Ethan stood staring with his phone light pointed at them, and his mouth was wide open. One of the other guys whispered, "I can't," and he started to back away. We went down the stairs. We didn't talk until we got back to our floor. When we got back into my room, everybody went quiet. They could tell by our faces that we were not joking. Ethan held up his phone and said he had an incoming call while we were in the service hallway. It was time-stamped, and there was no number. The screen showed a blank where a number should have been. Nicole even looked pale, and I realized she was not enjoying this. We tried to calm ourselves down by blaming each other, which is what people do. We said someone must have been messing with us. Someone must have planted something. Someone must have poured some water. Someone must have found a way to do that voice. But that doesn't make complete sense. We couldn't figure out how wet, bare footprints could appear and go up a wall. We couldn't figure out where the water smell in the service hallway came from. We could not figure out the handprints. People left after that. Nobody wanted to keep drinking or keep playing anything. Later that night, after the room was quiet and Ethan was sleeping, I heard footsteps above us. We were on the second floor. The footsteps were slow, not stomping. They moved back and forth, covering the same stretch over and over. I lay there staring at the ceiling, counting my breath because I didn't want to move. At some point, I felt something touch my wrist. It was cold, damp. I sat up so fast that I nearly fell off the bed. But there was nothing there. The next morning, I went to the library. I just didn't know what else to do. I ended up in a section that had old campus planning documents and local history junk. I didn't even know our library had that until I started wandering. I had a binder that had maps and project summaries from campus expansion. I flipped through it until I saw a map that showed the area where the dorm had been built. It had a note on it, small and bland, that made my stomach drop. Former settlement site. Cleared. Relocated. There were no details or notes about what relocated meant. I do not know who lived here before us, but I do know that after reading that, I could smell that mud smell again, the one from the service hallway, so I left the library. I put in a transfer to get out of that dorm at the end of the year. As far as I know, plenty of people have stayed there and never had a problem. And most folks probably think that legend is funny and not real. But I believe it. The Echo of a Man, from Somnians. I lost my left hand when I was a kid. I say lost because it's the easiest way to put it without having to explain the whole story every time. It was an accident, and it was stupid, and it was fast, and it changed everything forever. I'm fine now. I've been doing two-handed jobs with one hand for most of my life, so I'm not here for sympathy. But it matters to this story because it affects what I notice and what I don't. And yes, it does take a while to write something like this up. I work at Aldi. I've worked there long enough that most things feel automatic for me. I know where everything is without thinking and what noises are normal, like when the freezer is about to throw a fit, or the way the floor squeaks when you walk on it after it's been mopped. I also know how people act when they come in and want to steal something. I know how people act when they come in because they're lonely or want somewhere warm. This happened 3 years ago. I still think about it sometimes when I'm closing and the store gets that empty feeling. It was late enough that the parking lot was mostly empty and the register area felt too bright compared to the rest of the store. It was one of those super slow nights where it seems like the clock is being lazy. A couple of people had come through and grabbing milk or beer, but that was it. If you've ever worked retail, you know what I mean when I say a slow day. It's not peaceful per se, it's kind of tense in a low-grade way, because you're just waiting for something to happen or half hoping nothing does. Could be a rush 1 minute or nothing. Around that time, a man came in. He didn't come in like a normal customer. He appeared older, maybe late 50s or early 60s, hard to tell. His clothes looked like they'd been slept in, all dirty and worn down. His jacket was too big and hung off of him like it belonged to a much bigger person. His hair was long and thin. He looked relieved to come inside after a long time outside. We get people like that sometimes. I'm not saying that to be cruel, it's just true. A lot of stores have to deal with it. The managers usually want us to discourage loitering. They don't want the store turning into a hangout spot. They don't want customers feeling uncomfortable. There are policies, but the reality is you have to use judgment. If someone comes in and it looks like they might buy something, you give them a little time. If they come in and just wander around or sit down or start to act weird, you have to decide when to step in. This guy came in and moved in a straight line. He walked through the entrance. He didn't look at the seasonal junk or the carts. He headed down the first aisle like he already knew where he wanted to go. He did not glance at the checkout lanes. He did not make eye contact with me. He didn't look around the store either. He walked like he was following instructions, like a pre-planned route. I watched him for a second because he stood out. I told myself it was nothing. People come in with their heads down all the time, so I waited. A few minutes went by, then a few more. The store was empty at the time besides me, one stalker somewhere in the back half, and our manager doing something in the office. It was quiet enough that I could hear the refrigeration units and the faint music overhead. Aldi music always feels like it's being played for nobody. I kept expecting the man to come up and check out with something small. That's usually the way it goes. They grab a soda, something cheap, a snack or a loaf of bread. But this man never came to the checkout. After a while, I started thinking about the other possibility. Sometimes people come in and they steal. Sometimes they come in and just wander because it's warm and bright, and they can pretend for 10 minutes that they're a regular person doing regular shopping. I waited longer than I usually would, because I didn't want to make a big deal if he was actually buying something. I also didn't want to be that employee who jumps on someone just because they look homeless. I've seen some coworkers I will not name do that, and it always feels gross. Most of the time it escalates for no reason. But he had been in there long enough that it was feeling odd. The store wasn't big. You can't wander around in an Aldi for 20 minutes without looping around. So I got up from the register and walked out from behind the lane. I went down the aisle he had gone down. I scanned the lanes between shelves as I walked, but I didn't see him. I went farther back, toward the middle. I checked by the coolers. I checked the aisle where the bread was, and the aisle with the canned stuff. I walked past end caps and looked down each row, but the man wasn't there. I felt a little stupid. I thought maybe he had come up while I was looking away, deciding not to buy anything and left. People do that all the time. I walked back toward the front. The entrance door didn't make its usual sound, and I didn't hear it open. I didn't hear anyone around. The store still felt empty, like it was before he ever came. I got back behind the register and told myself he was just gone. I went back to staring at the lane, waiting for the next customer, thinking about what I still needed to do before close. A couple minutes passed, but then I saw him again. He came in the same way as before. Through the front doors, same speed, straight in a line down the first aisle. He didn't look at me and did not hesitate. I sat up a little straighter because my brain took a second to catch up. My first thought was, did he leave and come back in without me noticing? That is possible. I felt embarrassed a bit, thinking I might have missed him leaving in the first place. The door is very visible from the register, but you get distracted sometimes. You look down, you look at your screen, you zone out. Still, the way he entered again this time bothered me. I mean, people don't usually enter twice in a row with the same exact routine unless they're doing something, or maybe they forgot something. I watched him go down the aisle again. I told myself this time I would keep a better eye out. I still didn't want to jump to any conclusions. I'm not going to call my manager over a guy walking back in. He disappeared into the aisles again, and once more he never came to the checkout. This time I didn't wait as long. I gave it a few minutes, then I stepped out. I didn't feel angry, I just felt, I don't know, strange, uneasy. I didn't like the way he was going in the store, not making a sound, being hidden. The idea I was in here with someone else that I couldn't locate was kind of uncomfortable. I walked down the same aisle he had gone down. I got to the point where the aisle opens up into the cross aisle, and I looked left and right. I then saw him ahead of me, near the middle of an aisle. It was a quick glimpse, but it was him. Same jacket, same hair, and the same posture. He moved past the end of the aisle and out of my sight. I decided to follow. I wasn't chasing him, I was walking at a normal pace. I wanted to see where he was going, and I wanted to make sure he wasn't doing something in the back of the store that he shouldn't have been. I turned into the aisle right after he passed through. He was gone. That aisle had no customers, and it was just a straight side line. The shelves were full height, but you could still see down it. But there was no one at the far end. He hadn't gone out the other side because I would have seen him cross the opening. I stopped and stood there, looking. This wasn't making sense. I checked the next aisle, then the one after that. I walked to the end of the aisle and looked into the cross aisle. No man, no movement, no sound. At this point, I could feel my face getting hot. I felt stupid again. But this was a different kind of stupid. It was the feeling you get when something simple should have an explanation, and you can't find one. I went back to the front and sat down behind the register. I didn't tell anyone yet. I tried to talk myself down. I must have missed him slipping into another aisle, or he doubled back. He left without me noticing, somehow, again. Maybe he was leaving through the back, even though that part wasn't open to the customers. But anxious brains invent possibilities. The store stayed empty. No customers came in for a while. The stalker was still doing his thing in the back, and I could hear boxes shifting sometimes. Besides that, it was quiet again. About an hour later, the same man came in a third time, and I kid you not, he had the exact same look, movement, direction, head down, everything. It was less like the same man coming in a third time and more like a video being played on repeat. No alteration, no difference in the way he walked in. I was flabbergasted. This time I felt my heart quicken. I put my hand on the counter and gripped it, needing to ground myself. I watched him go, and it didn't feel real. I waited, not moving from my spot, and I sat there for several minutes. But the man never came to the checkout. Then I decided to stand up on the counter. I was desperate to know what this man was doing, how he kept getting away. He had not come back out yet. I knew that for a fact. I'd been keeping a close eye on the entrance. When I stood on that counter and got on my tiptoes, I could see over every aisle. The man was not in the store. Immediately I went to the manager, and I called out for him. When he didn't answer my call, I called out to the stalker. He was the one to come up first. For a moment, he looked annoyed. Not at me exactly, but at the idea of extra drama late at night, when we were nearly closed. Then he saw my face, and his reaction became different. I was not calm at this time. I was trying to be calm, but something else was coming through, I'm sure of it. Without using the word ghost or glitch or anything, I began to explain to him what was going on. The manager showed up mid-explanation, so I started over. I said a guy who looked homeless kept coming in, walking down the same aisle, walking the same way, but never coming out. And it kept happening again and again and again. The manager told me to go take a smoke break. He said he would handle the register and the stalker would keep an eye out. He felt empathetic, not making fun of me, not annoyed, and that really helped me. He could tell I was rattled. I took him up on the offer. I went outside for a 15-minute smoke break. I needed the air. I know it's an oxymoron, smoking and getting air. Anyway, I stood by the side of the building where employees usually go. The parking lot was mostly empty. The rain had slowed down, but everything was wet, and the lights made the asphalt shiny. I was trying to get my breathing back to normal, trying to settle back on the idea that I was just overreacting. I kept replaying it in my head, thinking about the aisle where he vanished. How I would lose sight of him and never hear anything. No entrance, no exit, no little chime, no footsteps. This guy was either a ghost or a ninja. About 10 minutes into my break, the stalker came running outside. He looked startled. He was usually a laid-back guy, older than me. Not fearless, but not really caring about what happens. Beyond that, he's seen a lot in retail over the years. He looked me square in the eyes and said, "I saw him too. 4 times, and he never left." I stared at him, my brain wanting to reject what he just said. Eventually I replied, "Wait, what?" "The guy you described. He came in, I never saw him leave, and then he just kept coming in 3 more times." He explained how after I walked away for the break, he took over watching the store and the manager was at the register, so there were 2 sets of eyes on the store. We went back inside together. The manager was still at the register. The manager's face looked tight, or maybe tense is the better word. He asked if either of us had seen the man. We shook our heads, meaning if he was still in here, and I doubted he was, we hadn't seen him. The 3 of us searched the entire store, every aisle. We checked the back area that customers aren't supposed to go into. We checked the bathrooms, behind pallets and displays, and those weird little corners where someone could hide if they wanted to be a problem. And yet, after a full deep dive, there was no man. We finished closing like normal. There was nothing else we could do. The manager locked the doors, and we did our routine. And yet, I kept expecting the man to appear again. Thankfully, he didn't. When we left, the parking lot was still empty. Now, after all this, I don't really have a theory that makes me feel content. If he was real, a person, a human, I mean, maybe we all missed something obvious. Or maybe it was something not so human that played a trick on 3 tired employees in a bright, empty store. Never speak to them. From No Name. I worked for a certain tribal school for 6 years as a groundskeeper. It's on the reservation I grew up in. If you know anything about this part of the country, down in the Southwest, you know the land out here holds things that don't like to be talked about. My job is to keep the grounds clean and maintain the fields, fix what needs fixed up, make sure the place is clean and safe for the kids. Most of my work happens after the school day ends. The kids clear out around 3:30, the teachers trickle out by 4:30 or 5, then it's just me until I finish up. Usually takes me till around 7, but that depends heavily on the season. My favorite part of the job is the quiet. Again, I grew up here, so the desert and the tree line at the edge of the property don't bother me. Well, they didn't used to. What I'm about to tell you happened not too long ago. I've thought about sharing it since then, but I kept talking myself out of it. I didn't really feel like putting it into words. My grandmother says that talking about these things gives them power, gives them a way to find you again, and that scares the bejesus out of me. But I'll be moving soon, and I think people need to be warned. You shouldn't make the same mistake that I did. It was a Thursday when I checked the athletic equipment to make sure the basketball courts are clear of debris before the weekend. The courts are at the far east end of the school property, right where the maintained grass gives way to brush and woods. It's maybe 200 yards from the main building to the courts, and another 50 yards from the courts to the tree line. That evening, there was a mist rolling in from the hills. It happens when the temperature drops fast after a warm day. The sun was getting low, and that time of day is usually beautiful. But that night, the mist made everything feel creepy. I remember it being very, very quiet. Not even wind that night. It was so quiet, I heard nothing but my ears ringing. I was picking up trash near the bleachers when I saw it. I thought it was a kid. There was a small shape stepping out from the tree line, about 30 yards into the mist. A silhouette, really. I couldn't make out much more detail than that. Just this outline of what looked to be a child. Small, probably the size of a 7 or 8-year-old kid. I was thinking that one of the students had stayed behind and wandered off. I've had kids hide in the bathroom after school hours. Some have snuck off and fallen asleep, waking up well after the day had ended. They're often confused when everyone's gone. So I didn't panic. I set down my trash bag and started walking toward the courts. I called out to it. "Hey, what are you doing out there?" The silhouette reacted to my words, stopping instantly. I kept going. "School's over, buddy. You need to come back. I can call someone to pick you up." And then it laughed. I could never describe that sound in a way that makes you truly understand it, but I can say it was like a kid's laugh, a bit high-pitched and light, but it bounced around like it was coming from everywhere, from the woods, from behind me, from inside my own head. And underneath that laugh was something else, like a second, lower sound that reminded me of breathing or growling. Every hair on my body stood up. I stopped walking. I even stopped breathing for a moment. Because at that second, I remembered every story my grandmother ever told me, every warning from my elders, all the pieces of folklore I'd brushed off as superstition when I was younger, when I thought I knew better than everyone else. You don't speak to them. You do not acknowledge them. You don't give them your attention, because your attention is an invitation. And I had just called out to it, twice. The silhouette stood there for another few seconds. I couldn't see its face, couldn't see anything but that small dark shape against the gray mist. Then, slowly, it turned and walked back into the woods. I stood frozen until it disappeared completely into the trees. When I could finally move again, I walked back to the main building as quickly as I could. I had about an hour left on my shift. I spent it inside the building, finding busy work in the hallways and the gym. I mopped floors that didn't need any more mopping, and I checked locks that were already locked. Anything I could do to stay inside, stay in the light, stay away from the windows that faced the tree line. The whole time I felt watched. You can call it paranoia, but it felt more like knowing, like I knew something was coming or waiting. By the time 7 p.m. came around, the sun was almost completely down. The parking lot had one working light, and it barely covered a quarter of the gravel lot. My stupid self had parked the truck near the far end. I always leave the closer spots for teachers and visitors to be nice, but that day I regretted it. I walked to my truck with my keys in hand. I didn't dare look at the tree line. I kept my eyes straight ahead. I got to my truck door, unlocked it, and climbed in. Then I pulled the door shut behind me. And the second I did that, something landed on the roof of my truck. The entire vehicle rocked. The impact was so hard I thought the roof might cave in. I yelled, and I slammed my hand down on the lock button so hard I thought I broke it. Then the other sounds started. Scraping, clawing sounds, like something with long, hard nails trying to dig through the metal above my head. I could hear it moving and shifting its weight, dragging something sharp across the roof in long strokes. It wasn't frantic. It was steady, just working its way through. I couldn't even move. I sat there with my hands locked on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead, too scared to even turn my head. I thought about just starting the truck and flooring it, but I couldn't even move my hands towards the ignition. Then I thought about my phone. Could I call someone? What could they even do? And wouldn't that require further acknowledgement? Suddenly, the scraping stopped. For a few seconds, there was nothing, just silence and my own breathing. Then I heard it move to the front of the truck. The hood dipped slightly under its weight. It was right there, right on the other side of the windshield, but it was too dark to see anything clearly. Just a shape, a mass. I squeezed my eyes shut. I couldn't help it. I didn't want to see it. I was just too scared. I was shaking so hard that now I was shaking the truck. Or maybe it was still the thing moving. I couldn't tell. Suddenly, it jumped. I heard it leave the hood with a sound like a coiled spring releasing. My eyes flew open just in time to see something land in the gravel about 20 feet ahead of my truck. It was lit for a moment by the distant parking lot light. Primarily what I saw were legs. Legs that were extremely long and thin, unrealistically so, bent backward, like an exaggerated version of dogs' legs. They were much too thin and bony looking to even be able to walk. And yet it moved, bounding and leaping and covering ground faster than anything I'd seen move at that size. It was gone into the darkness in less than 2 seconds. I sat in that truck for about 20 minutes before I could make myself turn the key. I drove home, going 20 over, and I kept every light in the cab on. When I got home, I didn't get out of the truck until my brother came outside to see why I was just sitting in the driveway. I told him I was okay, but I didn't tell him what happened, not until after I went to see my grandmother the following day. I asked her to pray with me, and she knew without having to ask. I still work at that school. It's not a job I can afford to quit, but I don't stay past sundown anymore. And I never stare towards the tree line for too long. Some things don't need your attention, and some things, once you give it to them, don't forget. What the heck was this? From Boss M.O. I'm a firefighter. Last August, in the middle of a bad fire year, we'd just come back from 9 straight days on a Type 2 assignment. The other 3 guys on my crew were out cold by 9 p.m., sprawled in the bunk room at our suppression crew station in Northern California. I've never been able to sleep right after a deployment. Too much adrenaline and too many days of irregular hours. So I was sitting in the kitchen with the lights off, scrolling through my phone and drinking water. My way of winding down. The 2-bay garage was open to the night, because it always was in the summer. The building doesn't have AC, and the bays turn into ovens otherwise. Around 11:30, I heard something from the garage. It sounded like a whisper. Specifically, it sounded like someone going, "Psst," like someone was trying to get my attention. I figured one of the guys had woke up and actually needed my attention on the down low, so I walked through the doorway into the first bay. Both engines were sitting there, gear hung on the racks, everything in their place. The garage door was open to the night, and I could see the gravel apron and the tree line beyond. Psst. It came from outside, just around the corner of the building, past where the floodlight reaches. I stepped out onto the apron. The air was still smoky from the fires to the north. I couldn't see anyone. "Hello?" I said, not too loud, but to be honest, I'm not sure why I was keeping my voice down out here. There was nothing at first, until, "Psst, over here." Now, it sounded like words, and yet it did not sound like speech. Imagine how a lyrebird mimics noises. It can sound like an almost perfect imitation, but you can tell that it doesn't come from the actual source. That's the best I can do to describe it. It was coming from the far corner of the building where the brush starts. I walked toward it, and everything I noticed was dead silent. I was about 15 feet from the corner when something moved in the brush ahead. Something big enough that the bushes parted and swayed like something heavy had just passed through. I stopped walking. I could hear it settling in there, branches creaking, and then it went still. Psst, over here. The sound came from inside the brush, about 10 feet from me, low to the ground, but not low enough. Whatever was making that sound, it was right there, hidden, waiting, and wanting me to come closer. Never in my life has every hair on my body stood up all at once, but it did then. And every cell that made me up was screaming at me not to run, but to go back inside calmly, as calmly as I could. So I started to back up, one step at a time, never turning around, until I hit the gravel apron and the floodlight was on me again. Then I went inside and pulled down the garage doors, and I sat in the kitchen until sunrise. Later on, I told the guys about this, but they joked about it and poked fun at me for getting scared of a mountain lion or a bear. Doesn't matter. I don't sit in the kitchen with the garage doors open at night anymore. A series of stories from Rosie's Choices. I got myself into babysitting and got really popular among the neighborhoods. All the popular parks, clubs, and local stores. I usually get evening calls for parents who need a night out, but occasionally I get called during the days. Here are some stories I've collected. I babysat a little one that I'll call Alex. Alex was a toddler and didn't know how to speak clearly yet. It was during the day and they woke up from their afternoon slumbers. We decided to go to the park. Fortunately for us, there were other children Alex's age at the park. We took some toys and the children were having fun. This park was a cute little place, just down the street from the house. I like to use this park whenever I babysit in the area. This park is divided by a standard metal fence, like the ones you see in the baseball batting cages. On the other side of that was a house. The first few times we went there, I didn't think much of the house. Maybe that I'd hate all the park noise sometimes, if I'd lived there. The more I sat across from that house, the more it creeped me out, though. I didn't say anything to anyone about that. If I talked to a parent, it's just playground banter. If it's with kids, it's sandbox banter. There was a small window on the top floor of the house. The lights were always off there, or at least very dimly lit. You could almost see the dark wallpaper with a few picture frames on the walls. On that day, Alex was happily throwing a ball against the fence. I was encouraging them to throw the ball higher. They were trying, then suddenly stopped. Slowly, they looked up at the window and pointed, then began to cry. I held them and consoled them, trying to figure out what happened. The window that they pointed at, there was nothing there. That room was dark. The crying started to worsen, so I carried them to the bench to go somewhere else, to get away from the house. Other parents also saw the sudden stop and pointing. They came over and told me that house always creeped them out too. But admittedly, they didn't want to sound crazy, so they hadn't said anything until now. One other nanny came with us to a local children's store to look at some toys and books. She told me to be careful. Kids are more vulnerable to certain things. We never know how, if, or when they'll come into contact with unexplainable things. I worked at a private residence for the first time. I was there for a week to cover their sitter's vacation. They were coming back from a family trip and asked me to come in the day before to collect the keys and get a tour. I met the house manager. She showed me the routine, the nursery, and the child's bedroom. This particular family was very detailed and had a routine. I felt very unsettled for some reason, but I blamed it on nerves. But even that was odd for me because I've babysat for ages, and I usually didn't get nervous like this. We stood by the doorway of the nursery. She asked me, "How are you feeling so far? Are you getting it?" I replied, "Yeah, it seems pretty straightforward. I think I've got it. Guess I'm just a little nervous at a new house." "No, it's definitely the house. This particular part of the house is worse. You'll see," she replied. "Oh, can't wait," I laughed. Then she stopped me. "To put it bluntly, there's like this old man spirit here. He's grumpy, but he loves kids, never harms kids. But the adults he likes to bother. He might play some tricks on you." She looked at me intently. I looked back, waiting for the joke to reveal itself. But she was serious. I laughed anyway. "I haven't noticed anything yet. I guess he's filling me out so far, huh?" We both smirked a little, and I said my goodbyes before leaving. When my first shift started, I did what was on the agenda: to set up the nursery for maximum exploration. It was such a beautiful morning. As I was pulling up the blinds, a toy on the opposite side of the room fell on the floor from a shelf. I looked around and even poked my head outside the door. No one there. I noticed, too, that the lights often flickered, which was odd considering it was a newer house. When I asked the housekeeper and the chef, they mentioned things like that often happened in that particular part of the house. They said I should be thankful it's only a week-long contract. Experiencing toy dropping, things going missing, and lights flickering was enough for a lifetime. A friend of mine needed to leave for a while for a personal emergency, and I stayed over to take care of their kids and their house for a bit. The oldest took care of themselves, and the youngest was 3 and full of energy. The grandparents came over for the weekends. They gave me the weekend to settle in since this was very last minute, and the grandparents didn't have the energy to do it for that long. They went out for the day, and they said they may come back late. I've known this 3-year-old since he was in the mommy's tummy. I've hit the auntie status. He was so excited that I would be staying with him. This was during the winter time. It got dark before 6 p.m. I was listening to a podcast, settling into my bedroom. I had the door open, and in the corner of my room I saw a shadow running into the closet. I snuck in and said, "Boo!" But there was no one in there. I walked out of the room and walked around the house. There wasn't anyone home. I haven't told my friends to this day, and I haven't taken any babysitting gigs for them at their house. When the walls of your work speak. From Anonymous. When it comes to Wendigos, skinwalkers, and paranormal activity, I think they attach themselves to those who are more sensitive to that stuff. But I haven't had too many experiences with them. I work for a company in an office building downtown in a busy city. We have a small team of workers, so we get along pretty well. With how our office is set up, I ended up in an office with a walk-in storage closet, while most of the others had smaller closets. I let a few people use my closet as I didn't need all that space. I also have a open door policy as long as I'm not in a meeting, and I lock up all the important files. As a note, these names have been changed for anonymity. Kyle is the type of person who could easily make people laugh. A few years ago, he started to pull little pranks, and we pay it back to him. Nothing that would hurt someone, though. Even our boss gets into it. Kyle is one of the few who keeps some of his work items in my closet. During winters, when it gets dark early, I only turn on yellow light lamps, because office lights tend to give me a headache. One night while we were getting ready to leave, I had my back against the door, while some of my colleagues were putting stuff away in my closet. I heard this little giggle that sounded like Kyle. I turned around, saying, "Kyle, what are you up to in there? You better not be messing up my closet." I didn't hear anything, so I went in the closet and no one was there. I chalked it up to Kyle possibly talking nearby my office somewhere. As I was closing my closet, in the corner of my eye, I saw this shadow run out of my office. This shadow was too clear to be mistaken for my eyes playing tricks. I looked out of my office and there was only Sarah, who was at the end of the hallway locking up her office. She saw me as she began to walk down. She asked, "Are you okay?" Did you see Kyle? I think he's playing with me," I said with a laugh. "Oh, he left a little early today." "Why, what did he do?" she asked with a smile, like she suspected another prank story. "Really? I don't want to sound crazy, but what? What happened?" She sounded concerned now. "I heard a giggle in my closet. It sounded like him. Then this shadow ran out. That's why I poked my head out of my office just now. I thought I'd see him," I said. She looked at me like she didn't really believe me, then said, "Probably Light's playing tricks on you, or he's gotten you on edge. But no, he's not here right now." She waited for me to grab my bags and we left together. A few weeks later, I went to our community workstation with an armful of stuff and forgot my ID badge, which works as a card key to enter certain areas of the office. I asked Kyle, who was walking past my office at the moment, if he could grab my badge from my desk for me. He came out and told me that it wasn't there. At first, I thought he was playing around and laughed. "Kyle, are you being serious?" He replied, "Yeah, there's no badge on your desk. All seriousness." I went back and it really wasn't on my desk. I remember taking it off to readjust my clothes and leaving it on my desk. I checked my bags, the floor, my drawer, the closet, my jacket pockets, and retraced my steps where I'd been in my office. I know it had to be in my office somewhere. I had just used it before this. I couldn't find it all morning, so I let management know it had gotten lost. Everyone asked Kyle if he took it, and he said he really hadn't touched it, and that he wouldn't go as far as to ruin someone else's work, which is true. He hasn't done anything that could jeopardize people's work. For the rest of the day, I'd been locking my office door whenever I left. A few of us went out for lunch, and when I went back to my desk, it was sitting exactly where I'd left it when I first took it off. I asked the office manager, Candace, if she or our boss dropped it off while we were out. She said that no one had been in my office since we left, at least not to her knowledge, but she was in the bullpen since we left, and no one went in. Candace and our boss would be the only ones who would have the key to my office. I told Sarah and Kyle about where I found it. They seemed genuinely as dumbfounded as I was, because we were looking for it together. About a week after that, I noticed how things shifted around my office. Except it's not just my office. Others were experiencing it as well. I've been in this company and this office long enough to know all the normal sounds that it makes. It started with a pile of folders behind me. It slid as if something bumped into it when nothing had. Things would fall off the shelves in my closet when they never had before. A coworker I share a wall with, it once sounded like he threw something or punched the wall we shared. When I went to check in on him, his shelf had fallen, and a few things fell that made those sounds out of the blue. Sarah and Kyle also mentioned how some things are always slightly off. Kyle accused us jokingly that we moved his stapler under his desk as a joke, when we hadn't. Sarah mentioned she would find her lunch bag under her desk all the time, when she normally places it on the counter behind her. We thought it was just one-off experiences, or that we were pulling jokes on each other. But now we are experiencing things together still, like sometimes we hear tapping on our walls, as if someone is knocking on our door, or someone is moving stuff around us. We often get college interns or high school students as volunteers. It's not weird to get assigned interns every college semester. On my intern Fiona's first day, she was brought to my office around 9 a.m. After we got acquainted, I gave her a desk in my office, and we went on a tour. I noticed she was quiet, maybe shy in nature. I didn't think too much of it when she didn't say much, as I'm also an introvert. I can be a person of few words sometimes. I assigned her to read over our manual. I noticed she kept her jacket and her backpack on the whole time. I told her she was welcome to get comfortable. She could hang her jacket in my closet. It's relatively safe, I told her. She could use a locking drawer as her locker too, and she said she was fine. A while later, she told me that she was done with our manual. I gave her easy first day tasks, mostly to get her familiar with the office layout. One of those tasks was to take some documents to the boss's office, which was at the other end of the office. After about 10 to 15 minutes, I didn't see her. I called my boss and asked if she got there all right to drop off the documents. He said that he got them about 10 minutes ago. I texted and called her, but there wasn't a response. I decided to take a walk around the office, in case she'd gotten herself lost. I was talking to one of my colleagues when I noticed Fiona turning into the hallway to the washroom and emergency staircase. I excused myself and headed to that hallway. When I got closer, I called her name. "Fiona!" I didn't get a response. I opened the emergency exit door. I didn't hear anyone on the staircase, but I still called out again. "Fiona!" Still no response. I was heading back to the hall to check the washroom when I saw her coming out of the washroom. "Hey, Fiona!" She didn't even flinch or turn. She just turned toward the corner away from my office. When I also turned the corner, she wasn't there anymore. There wasn't anywhere she could go from there other than other offices. If she wanted to leave, she'd need to wait for the elevators. Kyle, who was standing in front of his office, asked what I was doing. "Have you seen Fiona, my intern? She's wearing her jacket and her bag still," I asked. "Yeah, I saw her turn the corner and I haven't seen her since," he said jokingly. "Did you make her feel so miserable that she just left?" "Ha ha, Kyle," I said while going back to my office. I approached Candace. "Did you see Fiona, my intern?" "I saw her going into the kitchen. I followed her in there to show her how the kitchen works. But when I went in, she wasn't there. And I swear I saw her going in, but not coming out." She looked at me, puzzled. There's only one way in and out of that kitchen. Candace is really strict about how organized and clean our work kitchen is. If anyone even breathes towards the kitchen, Candace would know about it. So I know she was as lost as I was about it. I put a work blast out, asking to direct my intern towards me when they saw her. A few minutes later, Candace came in, saying that her school had contacted us. She was out of her intern program. The receptionist said she signed out without saying anything or making eye contact. Sarah also mentioned how she would see her one second and not the next, when we were talking about how strange it was. Our office is a big rectangle with a small hallway with the washroom and emergency exit. A person would have to deliberately sneak around to be hidden like that. I understand that all these could have logical reasoning or seem fake, but these are just some weird experiences among many. Or you just have to be there to experience it. I'm only sharing because I ran out of logical explanations. My DoorDash creep, from Whale Shell, 19X. I started doing DoorDash about 2 years ago to make some extra money on top of my usual job. I would usually dash in the evenings after work, about 3 or 4 nights a week, depending on how I feel. I know my area pretty well at this point, which restaurants are fast and which ones will have you waiting 20 minutes for a sealed bag. And I know which neighborhoods tip well. I'm not saying this to brag about it, but to tell you that when something feels off in my routine, I notice it pretty quick. I had just started picking up more shifts leading into the holidays. I got this order around 8:30 p.m. for a Thai place I pick up from regularly. Good restaurant, usually quick. The order itself was normal, about $40 worth of food. The delivery address was in a neighborhood I'd been to a handful of times, some older apartments, not sketchy though, just quiet. When I pulled up, the building didn't have much great lighting out front. The instructions said to come to the 3rd floor and hand it to them directly. I don't love hand-it-to-me orders at night, but it's part of the job. I grabbed the bag and went up. The hallway on the 3rd floor was dim. None of the lights were broken or missing. They were just all super dim, and the place smelled like old carpet. I got to the door and began to knock. There was no response at all for about 30 seconds. So I knocked again. I could hear movement inside now, like someone shuffling, but still no one came to the door. I was about to just leave it and take a photo when the door opened maybe 4 inches. They didn't have a chain, I noticed. They just cracked it open barely enough to see a sliver of face. It was a man, seemed to be in his mid-40s. He didn't say a word. He stared at me through that little crack. "Hey, I've got your DoorDash order," I said, holding the bag back up. He didn't reach for it, but he did keep staring. At me, not the bag. After what felt like ages, but was probably 5 seconds, he opened the door a little wider and took the bag without a word. He didn't close the door right away either. I said, "Have a good night," and I turned around and began to walk back down the hallway. But even then, I could still feel that he was standing there. I didn't want to look back. I got in my car and left. I rated the delivery as weird in my head and moved on. That's the thing about this job. You meet all kinds of people, and most of the awkward ones are just socially off. It doesn't always mean more than that. About a week later, I was doing a delivery in a completely different part of town. I had just dropped off an order at a house and was walking back to my car when I noticed a dark sedan parked across the street with its headlights off. Someone was sitting in the driver's seat, though. I could tell. I wouldn't have thought twice about it, except that when I pulled away, the sedan pulled out behind me. Coincidence, I hoped. It followed me, though, for about 6 turns before I told myself I was being paranoid again, and it turned off. But this happened again about 3 days later. It was a different neighborhood, the same dark sedan, though. I was picking up from a burger place, and when I came out with the order, I saw it parked in the lot. I couldn't see the driver clearly, but someone was in there. I did my delivery, and even took a weird route home, turning randomly through side streets. I didn't see the car again that night, but something in my gut wouldn't let me relax. Over the next 2 weeks, I saw that sedan at least 5 more times, always during my dashes, always parked somewhere nearby, but never directly behind me for long. It was like whoever it was knew my general area, but not my exact route. So I started changing things up, like when and where I dashed. I'd skip nights or drive to a zone 20 minutes away. For a few days, I didn't see it, and thought maybe I'd been overthinking it. But then I came home one night after a shift, and my apartment door was unlocked. But I know I locked it before I left. I always lock it. I live alone, and locking the door is just automatic to me. I stood in the doorway for a minute and listened. Nothing. I walked through every room slowly, checking the closets, checking behind the shower curtain, but there was no one there. However, things were slightly off. A drawer in my kitchen was open about an inch. One of my couch cushions was shifted too, and my bedroom window, which I never opened, was now unlocked. Sure, none of it was dramatic enough to call the police over. Nothing was missing or broken, but I knew someone had been in my apartment. I decided to install a cheap camera inside my apartment the next day. I pointed it at the front door. I also began writing down every time I saw the sedan, the date, the time, the location, and anything else I could note. I told my friend Maddie about everything. He said I should go to the police anyway, but still I felt like I'd be wasting their time, like I didn't have enough evidence. At this point, it was just a car I kept seeing, and an unlocked door one time. They would think I was losing it. 2 days after the camera went up, I checked the footage after a shift. There it was. About 2 hours into my dash, someone opened my front door, walked in, and stood in my living room for about a minute before walking back out. The camera quality wasn't that great, but it was clearly a man, average build, wearing a hoodie and a ball cap. He didn't take anything. He seemed to just stand there and look around for a moment. It was like he was checking if I was home, and he looked comfortable doing it. I went to the police that night. I showed them the footage, my notes, and everything, and they took my report. They told me they'd look into it, and to call if anything escalated. They also told me to consider changing my locks, which I did the next morning. But honestly, their response did not make me feel much safer. A report is just paper. I kept door dashing, but truthfully, I was on edge every single night. I would check my mirrors all the time. I would sit in my car for a few minutes before going inside, watching the street. The sedan showed up twice more over the next week. Once near a Chick-fil-A I pick up from a lot, and once parked on my street. On my street. That made me feel very sick. I called the police again about the car being on my street. They sent someone to patrol the area, and by the time they got there, the car was long gone. I followed up on the report twice, but nothing came of it. There were no leads or plates they could run, nothing they could do. I had to break my lease to move to a different apartment across town the following month. I didn't tell anyone the new address except Maddie and my family. I changed my dashing zones completely, and I stopped dashing at night for a long time, only doing lunch shifts on weekends. It felt like I was starting over, and I hated that. I was angry about it. It's been about 5 months now, and I have yet to see the sedan again. I haven't had any signs of someone being in my apartment either. I did eventually go back to evening dashes, just in different areas. I don't know who this guy was, or what his problem with me was, but I'm glad it's over, for now. The most unsettling man I've ever met. From Piece of Reese. I'm going to keep this vague on purpose. I won't be naming the facility, the state, or the man. People I work with know this story, and they'll know it's me writing this. But I'm not putting details out there that could come back on my career. I've been in corrections for going on 11 years. County level. And after that much time, you see a lot, and you've heard a lot. Most of it you forget because you have to. But this one I can't forget, even though I've tried. We process a high volume of people. DUIs, domestics, warrants, the usual rotation. You learn real fast not to take anything personally in here. These guys will say the worst things imaginable to you because they're angry and drunk and sometimes scared. But it rolls off. That's the job. But every now and then you get someone who unsettles you in a way that has nothing to do with what they did on the outside. It's something about how they carry themselves on the inside. He came in on a Tuesday night. I was working intake. The charge was aggravated assault, which we get plenty of, so nothing about the booking stood out on paper. Arresting officers brought him in, and he seemed cooperative. He was polite even. That's not unusual either. Plenty of people are calm during booking because the adrenaline is gone and reality is setting in. But this wasn't the same as that. He wasn't calm like someone defeated. He was cozy, even. Like he'd been there before, except he hadn't. He didn't have any priors. I ran him myself to check. During processing, he made small talk. He asked me how long I'd been doing this, and if I liked it. Normal enough questions, but he asked them more like my doctor asking if it hurts. As if he already had some idea and wanted to see if I'd confirm it. I gave him short answers and moved him along. He looked me right in the eyes the entire time. There was no ounce of anger or hatred or anything. He just locked in, like he was trying to read me. A little weird, but fine. When I walked him to his holding cell, he said to me, "You're gonna have a rough time tonight. Not because of me. Someone on B block is going to give you problems around 2:15. A medical issue. You should check on him before that." He said it so casually, like telling me the weather's gonna get bad or that there's traffic on the highway. I said something like, "All right, Thanks for the heads up. I was being sarcastic. At about 2:10, an inmate on B block had a seizure. He'd never had a seizure before in his life, nothing in his medical history. I wasn't even on B block. I heard it on the radio. I stood there for a second and felt every hair on my arms stand up. Then I told myself it had to be a coincidence. People have medical emergencies in here all the time. There's no way a man in a holding cell on the other end of the facility would know about this. I put it out of my mind, or I tried to. He was with us for a few days before his hearing. In that time, I interacted with him maybe 4 or 5 more times. Beyond the weirdness, he was a model detainee. No issues with other inmates or with staff. He followed every instruction immediately. But he talked. Not excessively and not loud, he'd just say things. Things that made you stop for half a second too long. I was doing a routine check and he was sitting on his bunk, hands in his lap, totally relaxed. He said then, "How's the daughter doing with the new school?" I don't wear a ring, I don't have photos on me, I have never once discussed my personal life with any inmate ever. I have a daughter, and at the time she had transferred schools about 3 weeks before this. I didn't respond. I kept walking. My hands were shaking a bit, and I was angry. I told my sergeant about the comment. He said the guy probably overheard staff talking or got information from another inmate who knew someone who knew me. That is possible. It's a small area. People talk. But it didn't feel like that, and I couldn't really explain why. The next day I was escorting him to a meeting with his attorney. He was cooperative as usual, walking ahead of me, and out of nowhere he said, "Davis is gonna quit, by the way. Probably by Friday." Davis was a newer CO, a young kid who seemed like he was adjusting fine. He hadn't had any complaints, and we didn't have any of him. I just ignored him, not responding to the comment. Thursday evening, Davis put in his resignation. When someone asked why, he said he'd been thinking about it for a while, and just couldn't do it anymore. He hadn't told anyone he was considering it. Word started to get around among the staff. A couple other COs had their own stories too. One CO said the man told him his wife was going to call him during the shift with good news. And she did, about an hour later. She'd gotten a job offer. Another CO said the man told him to drive safe on Wednesday because of black ice. And that officer ended up hitting a patch on his way home that night, nearly crashing into a ditch. And what gets me is the guy isn't like some kind of mystic sitting there being cryptic and spiritual about it. He was witty and sharp, and he would say these things with a little smirk. He'd work them into normal conversation like it was some joke. If you didn't know any better, you'd think he was just a clever guy making lucky guesses. But the accuracy was too consistent, and the details were often too specific. One evening I was doing final count and I stopped at his cell. He was lying on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. Without looking at me, he said, "You're a good man. That's going to make the next few years harder for you than it has to be." I stood there for a while. I so badly wanted to ask what he meant. But I didn't. I then kept on walking. He made bail 2 days later. He walked out as cooperative as he was when he went in, and he was still just as polite. He thanked the processing officer, collected his belongings, and he was gone. I looked up his case a few times after that. The assault charge got pled down. He got probation. He never did come back through our facility. As far as the system is concerned, he's just another name in the database. Eventually, I would tell this story to my wife. She's a nurse and has always been very practical. She said some people are just extremely perceptive and can read micro-expressions, body language, and patterns. A cold reading, she called it. That thing fake psychics would do on TV to impress people. And I get that. And I've thought about that explanation a lot. I mean, it could cover half of it. but it doesn't cover knowing about a seizure on a different block an hour before it happened. And it doesn't cover knowing a CO's wife got a job offer that the CO himself hadn't even known about yet. I've been doing this long enough that I don't spook easily. You can't. This job will eat you alive if you let every strange moment get to you. But I have never encountered anyone like that before or since. It wasn't that he knew things he shouldn't know. That alone I could maybe rationalize. But this man enjoyed it. It was amusing to him. Amusing like small talk. A way to pass the time, telling us these things and watching how we might react. And I still haven't forgotten about the being a good man will make things harder thing he said. Has he been right so far? Well, I'm not going to get into that, because I don't even know yet. You might find this man amazing, but I personally never want to see him again. The Pullover, from Ananya. I work about 40 minutes outside the town I live in. Most of my drive is a 2-lane rural highway. For long stretches at a time, there might be no streetlights at all. I pass a few farms, a gas station that closes at 9, and that's about it. I've probably driven through here over 100, maybe even 1,000 times by now. It was around 10:30 p.m. I'd stayed late to finish something up. There was almost nobody on the road at the time, which is normal for that time. About halfway through the drive, though, I noticed headlights behind me. They'd come up pretty fast and were now sitting close to me. They weren't tailgating me yet, but they were closer than you'd expect on an empty road when they could easily just pass. Then the lights started to flash, red and blue, mounted behind the grille. I thought, great, maybe I was going a little fast and didn't notice. I slowed down and pulled onto the shoulder. The car pulled in behind me. I turned on my interior light, and I put the window down, grabbing my license. I sat there waiting. The car just sat there too, the lights still flashing but nobody getting out. After maybe a minute, I started to watch my mirrors more carefully. The car wasn't a cruiser. There was no light bar on top and no markings I could see. It looked like a regular dark SUV with those grille-mounted lights you can buy online. That was the first thing I thought was wrong. Then a figure stepped out. A figure with no uniform, just dark clothes. They had a flashlight and they were shining it low, walking slow. Not the way an officer approaches a vehicle. There was no radio chatter and no spotlight. Just a person walking toward me with his flashlight. My stomach dropped. I looked at the road ahead of me, and then I saw them. There was someone standing on the right side of the road about 50 yards ahead of where I'd pulled over. Just standing there on the edge of the tree line. I could barely make them out, because they appeared to be trying to hide, but the silhouette was clear enough in my headlights. I made a quick decision then. I put my window up, put the car back in drive, and pulled off the shoulder. I heard the person behind me shout something, but I was going. I did not look back at them, but as I passed where the man was hiding in the woods, something hit my car. I think he threw something at me. I floored it and didn't ease off the gas until I was back in town. I called the police when I got home, and they verified that that was not one of theirs. They sent someone out, but didn't find anyone or any vehicle on that stretch. They told me I did the right thing by leaving, and that if someone pulls me over and it doesn't feel right, I'm within my rights to drive to a well-lit public area. The officer I spoke with said they'd had similar reports on rural roads in the county before. These days I take a different route. It's a little longer, but I don't care. I'm not about to be ambushed by some freaks on the road again. I'm a daycare worker. There's something wrong with one of the kids. From JCL. As a daycare worker, you love your kids, especially the longer you're around them. But there's something that happened over the course of a few months that I still can't make sense of. We had this little girl in our program named Nora. She was 3 when she started. She was a very sweet kid, very imaginative. She talked a mile a minute, and her mom was great. She was always on time for pickup and packed good lunches, always asking how Nora's day was with actual interest. It seemed like a normal, loving family, at least from everything I could see. Now, Nora had a habit of talking to herself during free play. Nothing crazy for her age. Kids often have imaginary friends, they might narrate what they're doing, or even have full conversations with just stuffed animals. That's healthy, normal stuff. But after a few weeks, I started to notice that Nora's conversations had a consistency to them that stood out. It wasn't babbling. She would talk about specific things, and she left spaces for responses, and she would laugh at things that no one said. She'd set out 2 plates during pretend kitchen, always 2, and say, "Here you go, Callie." I asked her once during snack time, "Who's Callie, sweetheart?" "My sister," she said. I didn't think much beyond that. Nora was an only child according to our information. Kids invent siblings all the time. I just said, "Oh, that's nice," and I went on with my day. Over the next few weeks, Callie came up more and more. Nora would get upset if another child sat in a specific chair at her table, because that's where Callie sits. During nap time, she'd scoot over on her mat and whisper. One afternoon, I heard her say, "Callie, stop, you're cold." She didn't seem scared, just annoyed. My coworker, Diane, noticed it too. She mentioned that Nora had told her Callie doesn't go home with her, that Callie stays here. That's when the weird feeling about this whole situation started. Imaginary friends usually follow their kid everywhere. This one apparently lived at the daycare. I brought it up casually with Nora's mom at pickup one day. I said Nora had been playing with an imaginary friend named Callie, and that I thought it was quite cute. But her mom's face did something I can't fully describe. It didn't fall exactly, but it kind of froze. She recovered quick and smiled, saying, "Oh, she's got quite the imagination." She changed the subject to what Nora had for lunch and left. It was fast, too fast. I let it go. It wasn't my place to push. Things got stranger after that. Not with Nora, but with the daycare itself. Toys would be out in the morning when I opened up, and I don't mean messed up or scattered. They appeared carefully placed, as if a kid had been playing with them and left them out neatly. There would be a few crayons on the table, a picture book open on the floor, the toy kitchen set with a pot on the little stove. I assumed the closing staff just missed them during cleanup, but when I asked, they swore everything was put away. Our closing checklist is thorough. Every bin gets checked, every surface gets wiped. This happened 3 times in 1 week, and by the 3rd time I began to take photos of how I left the room at close, comparing them to what I found in the morning. Things were being moved. I knew for sure now. Diane started to feel uneasy too. She told me that during nap time one afternoon, she counted the kids on the mats and got 21. She counted again and got 20. She said she was probably just tired, but she looked rattled telling me about it. Then there was the night that changed everything for me. We had a parent event one evening, a sort of open house, so families could see the classroom and meet each other. It wrapped up around 7:30. Afterwards, I stayed behind to clean up and reset the room. Diane had already left. The building was empty at the time. I had the lights on in the main room and the hallway, but the rest of the building was dark. I was wiping down tables when I heard a giggling sound from the hallway that leads to the bathrooms. It was clearly a child's laugh. Clear and close, no mistaking it. Someone was in the building with me. I stopped and listened, but I didn't hear anything else just yet. I told myself it had to just be pipes or the building settling somehow, maybe my brain playing tricks. I went back to cleaning. But then I heard it again, this time closer, right around the corner. I walked to the hallway. The lights were on, but the bathroom doors were open and dark inside. I looked down the hall. There was nobody there, but the air felt different, heavier even, and much colder. I turned back toward the main room, and I saw her. There was a child standing in the far corner of the classroom near the toy kitchen. A little girl, maybe 3 or 4 years old. She was standing there facing the kitchen set, like she was in the middle of playing. She had dark hair, and she was wearing what looked like a light-colored dress, but there was something wrong. She was incredibly still, absolutely motionless. Kids that age don't sit that still. They shift and fidget and run around, but this child was motionless. I couldn't move. I stood there with a wet rag in my hand and simply stared at this child that shouldn't be there. My chest was so tight, I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Eventually, I said, "Hello?" And my voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. She turned her head towards me, just her head, slowly. Her face was pale, and her eyes were open, looking right at me now. But behind those eyes there was nothing. No anger or sadness, just nothingness. I dropped the rag and grabbed my keys and my bag, and I left. I ran to my car and called Diane, telling her everything. She said to me that she believed me. The next morning I called our director, and I told her what happened. She's a kind but practical woman. She said it was probably a shadow or exhaustion from the event. I wasn't going to argue with my boss. About a week later, I looked something up that I probably shouldn't have. Nora's enrollment file had her mother's full name. I searched online for the family, and I eventually found something. An obituary from a few years before Nora was born. A baby girl, and her name was Callie. She had died at 11 months. The cause of death was not listed. I never said anything to Nora's mom, and I'm not going to. That poor woman lost a child, and whatever is happening at the daycare isn't hurting anyone. Nora's not scared. She talks to her sister like it's the most normal thing, and maybe for her it is. But even so, I'm not about to stay alone in that building anymore. I just won't. When I have to close, Diane closes with me every time now. These experiences have stopped now. Maybe it's just a gap in encounters. I am happy for Nora that she gets to see her sister. As long as Callie leaves me alone, we won't have a problem. Something lives under the town. From Anonymous. I want to be clear here. In this story, I'm not talking about rats, and I'm not talking about raccoons or possums that wander into storm drains. Those are easy to differentiate, be it in person or on camera, when we send inspection units down the line. Basically, we know how animals move in tunnels. But what I've been encountering over the past 2 years as a sewer maintenance worker is no animal. The first time was during a routine inspection of an older section of the system on the east side. These are the bigger tunnels, some of them built in the 50s and tall enough to walk through if you hunch. I was in there with my partner, checking for root intrusion. We had headlamps and a handheld spotlight. About 300 feet in, my partner stopped and said, "You hear that?" I listened for a second. There was a sound ahead of us that I can only describe as breathing. We stood there for about 10 more seconds, but then the breathing stopped. Ray made a joke about the city having its own Ninja Turtles situation, and we kept going. We didn't find anything unusual in the tunnel that day. But when we got back to the truck, I noticed Ray locked his doors, and that man never locks his door. A few months after that, we sent a camera down a line that had been backing up in a residential neighborhood. This was a standard CCTV inspection. I was watching the feed from the van. The camera rolled through about 600 feet of normal pipe, but then the image jerked. There was no static or interference or anything, but the camera physically moved, like something had bumped into it. The cable went taut for a second and then released. When the image stabilized, there were marks on the wall of the pipe that had not been there before in previous inspections. Long vertical scrapes in the buildup, 4 of them to be precise, like fingers dragged through. I noted this in the report as possible tool marks from prior maintenance, but I knew that it wasn't. Over the following year, I started keeping a personal log, sounds in sections of the system where there's no access point for animals to enter. A smell I'd catch occasionally that wasn't sewage. It was sour, almost acidic, and it would come and go in pockets like something had just passed through. Twice I found what I could only call nesting. Piles of debris pushed together in dry sections of larger tunnels. Rags and plastics and leaves, all mounded in a deliberate way. These were not washed together by flow. They had been arranged. The one that made me a believer happened about 6 months back. I was alone in a maintenance access chamber, doing a valve check. It's a concrete room, about 8 by 8 feet, with 2 tunnels feeding into it. I was wearing my headlamp, and I was crouched over the valve when I heard movement in the tunnel to my left. Slow and cautious sounding movement. Reminded me of someone sneaking around in shallow water. I quickly pointed my light into the tunnel. About 20 feet in, just at the edge of where the beam started to fade, I saw something pull back around the curve of the pipe. It was pale, and it moved on 2 legs. It was fast, but not panicked. It retreated, almost looking afraid. There was no sound after that. Whatever it was, it moved in near silence. Well, when it wanted to. I reported this as a possible trespasser. The city sent someone to check the access points in the area, but all were locked and all were secure. They found no sign of a forced entry or anyone living down there in the usual sense, like camps or trash or clothing. But they did point out the nesting piles I'd found before, but the inspector shrugged them off, blaming it on debris accumulation. My partner won't talk about it with me anymore. Says that if he wants to keep doing this job normally, that he doesn't want to think about it. But just last month, he requested a transfer to water treatment, and I know exactly why. He wants to get out of the sewers. No idea what's really down there, and I don't know if it's one thing or more than one. But it's bipedal, it's fast, and it's smart enough to avoid cameras and retreat from light. Scariest of all is that it's quiet and very good at hiding. Tonight's first story, the firefighter one, was pretty creepy. Short, but my favorite this episode. Reminds me of some short horror film I found back in the day, of this thing mimicking a baby's cry before eating some woman. Good stuff. Good night. Thank you so much for tuning in to Tales from the Break Room. I've been your host, Darkness Prevails. Make sure to follow and rate Tales from the Break Room on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube at the Darkness Prevails channel, and all your favorite podcast apps to help us grow. Thank you. And if you have a scary work-related story, send it to me at eeriecast.com/submit. Till next time, everyone, I'll be clocking out, because if I get back home late again, my wife will destroy me, and my toddlers will nibble at my remains. So I'll be clocking out for now. But I'll be back again real soon.
Hi, welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
Sometimes being American is so boring, what with my gold hockey medal and 1,200 calorie breakfasts. So I'm happy to say that I have a fun episode for you today that immerses us in a story straight from Scotland. A story about a man working to feed his family, but must endure the most hellish road in the world. This story, from One with the Contour, is titled The Drove Road. This is a tale from the break room. And you can find Tales from the Break Room on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. Follow us and leave us a rating if you like us. Thank you. My father was a livestock haulier in the Scottish Highlands for 31 years. He moved sheep and cattle between farms and markets across some of the most remote country in Britain, driving roads that don't appear on most maps, in weather that would keep sensible people indoors. In all that time, he only ever refused one route. If a contract required the B road between Kinlochmore and Cannock, he passed it to another driver and took the financial hit. And if you asked him why, he would change the subject so fast, you'd find yourself talking about football or the price of diesel before you realized what happened. He did this for 3 decades, and in those 3 decades, he explained himself exactly once. On the second to last night of his life, no less, in a hospital room in Inverness in the winter of 2004. 30 years of Richmond Super Kings had turned his lungs into something that could barely process air, and the man in that bed was so far from the man I grew up with that I had to remind myself more than once that they were the same person. He'd lost 4 stone. His skin had gone the color of dishwater. He breathed through a mask that fogged over with each exhale and cleared just enough between breaths to show his mouth moving underneath. And most of what he said in those final days was fragmented, drifting, half dissolved by morphine and exhaustion. But on that second to last night, when I was sitting beside his bed during a late visit because my mum had gone home to sleep and someone needed to be there, he turned his head on the pillow and looked at me with perfect clarity, saying, "Close the door." I closed it. He said to me, "Sit down." And so I sat. He then told me about the Drove Road, and he told it from beginning to end in a level and steady voice. But his eyes stayed fixated on the ceiling the entire time, like he was reading the story off the tiles. He talked for about an hour. When he was done, he closed his eyes for some time. I sat there, wordless, because there was nothing adequate to reply with. He died the following morning at 6:30. I was in the corridor getting coffee from the machine when it happened. That became one of those details that really shouldn't matter, but now I can't stop thinking about. Why was I grabbing coffee? Did it really matter? I've never repeated what he told me that night, but I am going to now. I'm 57 years old now, and this story deserves to be told. Also, as a note before I begin, I've changed all instances of kilometers to miles. I've spent most of my life in America at this point, and I know most people reading this will likely be American too. My father, Alistair, grew up in a village near Bewley, about 12 miles west of Inverness. He left school at 15. School wasn't producing results for anyone involved, and he got work on farms around the Glen, which in the Highlands in the late 1950s was less a career choice than a gravitational inevitability. He was good with animals, and good with engines too, but not particularly good with people, which is a combination that either makes you a mechanic or a haulier. When he got his HGV license at 20, he found that driving a loaded truck through empty landscape for hours at a stretch suited him quite well. He bought a second-hand Bedford TK from a dealer in Dingwall, and a livestock trailer from a farmer in Muir of Ord who was getting out of sheep. And by his mid-20s, he was making a decent living moving animals around the north of Scotland. Livestock haulage is unglamorous work, and I won't dwell on it long, but you need to understand a few things to follow what happened. A haulier's reputation depends on delivering animals in the same condition he collected them. Stressed sheep lose weight, panicked sheep trample each other. A bruise on a ewe's flank or a limp that wasn't there at loading is a mark against the driver, and enough marks mean farmers stop calling. My father was careful. He checked his trailer before every job. The floor, the walls, partition gates, bolts and hinges and welds. You see, a loose fitting or a sharp edge in a livestock trailer is a liability, and because he took a workman's pride in doing the job properly, he checked it thoroughly. I say this to you so you understand that when animals came off his trailer injured, he knew it wasn't the trailer. In the autumn of 1972, my father had said late October or early November, but he wasn't certain on the exact date. But he picked up a contract from a farmer named Drummond. Drummond ran a hill farm in a remote glen west of Cannock, which itself is a remote place, and he needed 60-odd blackface ewes moved to a lowland farm near Bewley for winter grazing. The distance was about 30 miles of road, but the route mattered more than the distance, because the most direct way between the 2 points involved a 12-mile stretch of single-track B road that crossed open moorland between the 2 glens. This road followed the line of what was locally called the Drove Road. Drove roads are old routes, some of them medieval, which were used for centuries to walk livestock to market. Scotland is full of them. Most have been paved over or absorbed into the modern road network, and you would never know you were driving on one unless someone told you. This one, though, was different, at least according to my father, because the locals still called it by a Gaelic name that he said translated to something like the Road of the Carried Dead. It had been a corpse road before it was a drove road, the path along which the dead were carried from the remote communities in the western glens to consecrated ground in the east. My father mentioned this as a background detail, but I could hear something underneath the words even through the morphine and the steady tone, something that suggested he wished he'd paid more attention to it at the time. He had driven the road before without incident, though he noted, and I remember him pausing here briefly as if catching himself, that he had always driven it during daylight. The Drummond contract was different because of the logistics. Drummond's farm was at the end of a 5-mile track that was more suggestion than road, and the loading process with hill sheep is slow. Because the animals are half wild, they don't share the lowland sheep's resignation about being pushed into a trailer. By the time Alistair got the first batch loaded and cleared the farm track and reached the B road, the light would be gone. November in the Scottish Highlands means the sun sets at 4:30, and 4:30 comes faster than you expect when you're wrestling blackface ewes up a ramp. I should describe the road here. It's a single-track tarmac with passing places, no markings, no cat's eyes, no lighting. It crosses open moorland, flat peat bog stretching away on both sides, treeless, featureless, with low hills on the horizon that are more felt than seen after dark. The road sits slightly raised above the bog, like a causeway, which means that in wet weather, the standing water on either side reflects your headlights back at you, and it can feel like driving across a black lake on a narrow bridge. In daylight, it's bleak but manageable. After dark, with nothing ahead of you but the reach of your headlamps and nothing behind but whatever you've already passed, it becomes something else. My father described it as driving through the inside of a closed eye. The first trip was in late October. He loaded 20-odd ewes at Drummond's place in the late afternoon. Drummond was there to help. My father described him as the kind of older Highland farmer who communicates primarily through hand gestures and monosyllabic instructions, delivered at a volume meant for someone standing 50 yards away on a hillside. They got the sheep loaded, Drummond closed the trailer gate and bolted it. Then my father pulled out. He made it to the moor road at dusk. The last of the daylight was a thin orange band on the western horizon, and the road ahead was already dark enough to need headlights. The sheep in the trailer were settled, which was what you wanted. The ramp and the loading are the stressful parts, and once they're in and moving, they usually calm down. He drove the 12-mile stretch at a steady 40, which is about as fast as you'd want to push a loaded livestock trailer on a single track. About halfway across, he noticed the time. The 12 miles at 40 should take roughly 18 minutes, and he'd been driving for what felt like about that long. But the cattle grid at the far end of the moor, the landmark that meant you were off the open ground and dropping into the next glen, had not yet appeared. He checked his watch. 25 minutes. He wasn't worried yet, just mildly confused. He thought perhaps he had misjudged his start time, or maybe he had gone slower than he'd thought. maybe both. So he kept driving. The cattle grid appeared after 47 minutes on this 12-mile road. My father was not a man who made errors about things like speed and distance. He had been driving professionally for the better part of a decade by then, and he could estimate his speed within a mile or two per hour without looking at the dial. He knew how long 12 miles took at 40. It didn't take 47 minutes. He shrugged it off as something odd and carried on to the destination farm. Because practical men like him, well, they archive things away, and they carry on. After all, there's no useful response to a road being longer than it should be. He unloaded at the receiving farm near Bewley. The farmer was a man called Geddes, and Geddes was waiting with the gate open and a torch in his hand, as it was past 7 by then and fully dark. They dropped the ramp and the sheep came out. The first 17 or 18 were fine. They trotted down the ramp and into the pen, in that stop-start uncertain way, like animals do when they're adjusting to solid ground after a moving floor. The last two, however, were limping. Both ewes, both favoring their front left leg, both with the same stiff, pained reluctance to put weight on it. And behind them, the last animal out, a ewe with a gash along her right flank that ran from just behind the shoulder almost to the hip. It was deep, deep enough that the flesh had parted, and you could see the pink of the muscle underneath. It was clean, almost surgically straight, as if it had been made with a blade, and not by an animal catching itself on some protruding edge. Geddes looked at the injuries, then at my father. My father said it wasn't quite an accusatory look he gave him, but certainly something that wanted explanation. Yet my father didn't have one. He had checked the trailer before loading, as he always did, and there was nothing in it that could produce a wound like that. Geddes cleaned the gash with iodine and wrapped it, and they agreed that the ewes must have knocked into each other during transit, which can happen when animals panic and scramble. Except these sheep had never panicked, not during the ride. They had been calm the entire way. My father had listened to the sounds of distress before. Stamping, bleating, the thud of bodies hitting the trailer walls, and had heard nothing on this trip. He drove home to Bewley and told my mother the delivery had gone fine. I mean, in the accounting of his mind, it had. Sheep sometimes arrive with injuries. Sometimes they have injuries as they load and you miss it. It was an imperfect business. He went to bed, he slept, and if he dreamed about anything, he didn't remember it in the morning. The second trip was 4 days later. The same route and the same time of day. Same conditions. An afternoon loading and a dusk departure that put him on the moor road after dark. This time he watched his clock from the moment his tires hit the single track. He drove at a careful, consistent 40, and he did not speed up or slow down, and he counted the minutes. The 12-mile crossing took 44 minutes, which at 40 miles per hour is a distance of just over 29 miles. The road was 12 miles long. He had just driven 29. He said nothing about this to anyone. It didn't make sense. He didn't want to dwell on it. Perhaps there was an error. If it was an error, it was not in his equipment, though. It had to be on the road. Perhaps the signs, perhaps something. He didn't know. At the Geddes farm, they unloaded. 3 ewes were injured this time, all with the same clean lacerations on the left side of the body, like something in the trailer was making a single cut across each animal at the same height and from the same direction. And there was one more, too. She was standing at the back of the trailer, facing the wall when they opened the gate. She didn't move when the others filed out, and when Geddes climbed in, coaxing her to turn around, he stepped back and said something under his breath in Gaelic that my father didn't catch. The poor thing's left eye was gone. The socket was open and empty and clean, like the eye had been lifted out by a surgeon, not torn or burst, and there was almost no blood. Maybe some thin, dry residue on the wool below the socket, but that's it. The ewe stood there and looked at them with her remaining eye, and she was calm. Entirely, horribly calm. My father wondered if it was adrenaline caused by the pain and fear. He and Geddes stood in the yard with a torch beam on that empty socket. and they didn't talk as they observed. Eventually, Geddes said it must have been a bolt, maybe a rough edge in the trailer, something the ewe had pressed her face against. My father knew every surface in that trailer down to the inch, and there was nothing that could do what had been done. He and Geddes both knew this, but neither of them said so out loud, and that knowing set between them like a stone. He drove home. He checked the trailer in the morning with a torch, running his hands over every surface, every join, and every bolt head. But he didn't find anything out of place. The interior walls were smooth, galvanized steel. The floor was clean. He couldn't even find blood anywhere, which itself was messed up. A wound like that eye, especially, should have left blood on the floor, on the walls, or somewhere. The trailer was as clean as the day he had loaded it. That night he dreamed he was walking the moor road in the dark, on foot, alone. There was something behind him matching his pace step for step, with a half-second delay, so that each of his footfalls produced an echo that was not quite an echo, as it came from the wrong direction. He walked for hours, and the road did not end. He woke up in his bed, with his heart going a mile a minute, and my mom asleep beside him. He told himself it was a dream. Then he went downstairs and found his work boots by the front door, with black peat mud on the soles. He stood there in the kitchen in the early light and looked at those boots. You see, he did not own peat land, and he had not gone outside as far as he could remember. My father nearly refused the third run. He phoned Drummond and said he was busy, which was a lie. November was slow, and he had no other contracts that week. Drummond offered more money, and my father said it wasn't the money. Drummond then cleared his throat and asked, "Your wife's expecting, isn't she?" And my father said yes. My mother was 6 months pregnant with me at the time, a detail I've never been able to sit comfortably with. Drummond then explained how he needed the work, and so offered him double the rate. My father said no, so Drummond said something else. My father repeated it to me in the hospital, exactly as he remembered it. And I'll do that for you as well. Drummond had said, "You've been across 3 times now, Alistair. Twice there, once back empty. That's 3 crossings of a road that wants 4. You think it matters whether you're driving it? You walked it last night in your sleep. It'll have you walking it every night until you finish what you started, or until it finishes for you." My father asked how Drummond knew about the walking, but he didn't answer that. Instead, he said, "Finish the contract. 4 loaded crossings, that's a full drove. That's what the road wants. Leave it at 3, and that there's unfinished business. And that road has been collecting unfinished business since before your grandfather's grandfather was born." My father took the job. I don't know why. He didn't explain his reasoning to me, and I've spent 2 decades considering the possibilities, and I still can't settle on one. The money was part of it. We were not well off, and a baby was coming. Double rate for a day's work was not something he could dismiss easily. But obviously it was more than that. I think Drummond's mention of the sleepwalking frightened him in such a way. It confirmed that what was happening was not contained to the road. It was following him home. The peat on his boots, the dreams, the road reaching into his house while he slept. If Drummond was right, then driving the road again was not adding to the danger. The danger was already present, accumulating, and the only way to discharge it was to complete the crossing, give the road what it wanted. He loaded the 3rd batch at Drummond's farm on a gray afternoon in the 2nd week of November. The sky was low and flat. The highland was overcast, making it impossible to tell where the sun was or how much light you had left. And the darkness, when it came, arrived without a transitional period. 1 minute, the moor was visible in washed-out gray, and the next, the headlights were cutting tunnels through solid black. He was on the moor road by 4:45. At mile 6, confirmed by his odometer, which he was now checking obsessively. He saw the figure. It was on the road ahead of him, walking the left-hand edge in the same direction he was traveling. His headlights picked it up at about 100 yards. The outline of a person, tall, wearing what appeared to be a long coat, hunched forward under the weight of something draped across his shoulders. The posture was that of a man carrying a heavy load, bent at the waist, arms raised to grip whatever was slung behind his neck. My father's first thought was that it was a stalker, not what you'd think when you hear the word stalker, but rather a deer hunter coming off the hill with a carcass. You carry a deer across your shoulders with the legs hanging down your chest, and from behind in poor light, that's approximately what this looked like. He slowed the truck. The road was single track and there was no room to pass without the figure stepping aside, so he dropped to walking pace and flashed his headlights. The figure, though, did not react. He tapped his horn, a short bleat that sounded enormous in the moorland silence, but no response. The figure kept walking at the same pace. My father rolled along behind it at 5 miles per hour, with his headlights fully on its back, and so more details began to resolve. The coat was long past the knees, and it was not a modern garment. My father said it looked heavy and shapeless, like rough wool or oilskin that you see in old photographs of agricultural workers from a century ago. The figure moved wrong too, stiff and repetitive, like the legs beneath the coat were operating on a mechanism, not through muscular intent. Each step was identical to the last in length and timing, no variation, no adjustment for the camber of the road or the rough surface. This was not like a living man's walk, constantly adapting to the ground beneath them. This was a walk that had been fixed and placed, and was simply repeating. The thing across its shoulders was no deer. The legs hanging down the figure's chest. My father could see them clearly now in the headlights, swaying with each step, were too thin and ended in small cloven hooves, and there were too many of them. He counted at least 4 distinct legs, possibly 6, layered over each other, which meant the figure was carrying more than one animal. Sheep. Dead sheep. Draped and stacked across its shoulders, and it was walking the drove road at 5 o'clock on a November night, as though this were a task it had been performing for a very long time, and intended to perform for a great deal longer. My father stopped the truck. He told me he didn't know why he did. Every functioning part of his brain was telling him to accelerate and get clear of this, but his foot went to the brake, and his hands went still. He sat in the idling cab with his headlights on the figure 20 yards ahead. He couldn't look away from it, and he couldn't move. He said it was like the road was holding him there, like he was trapped in some unseen current. Some unseen force had interposed itself and had told him to wait. The sheep in the trailer then started screaming. My father used that word specifically, and I'll use it here. He was a man who had spent his adult life around livestock. He knew the full range of sounds they make, and what came out of that trailer was not bleating and was not distress calls. It was a sound he had never heard from sheep before, and he said it was the sound of animals who knew, in whatever limited way that sheep could know anything, that something was present that was fundamentally incompatible with their being alive. The sound broke whatever was holding him. He released the brake, put the truck in second, and floored the accelerator. The Bedford lurched past the figure on the narrow road, doing 50 on a surface that was barely safe at 30. As he passed, he looked to his left through the driver's side window, and the figure was there, close enough that he could have reached out and touched it if the glass hadn't been between them. He saw its face then. My father described this once. Back in that hospital bed with his eyes on the ceiling, his voice perfectly steady, and his free hand gripping the bed rail so hard that the tendons rose up through the skin like cables. When he was done describing it, he closed his eyes and didn't open them for a full minute. I sat there and listened to his breathing apparatus cycle, and I didn't say a word. The face had been a man's face. My father was certain of this. The underlying structure was human, the proportions were human. The basic architecture of brow and cheekbone and jaw was that of a grown man. But the flesh over that structure had been transformed in a way that my father could only compare to the photographs he'd seen of bog bodies pulled from peat. The skin darkened to a deep reddish brown, compressed tight against the skull, shrunk and hardened by acid and time until it was less skin than leather. The lips drawn back from the teeth in a permanent, involuntary grimace, the sockets deep and shadowed. Peat preserved, tanned by centuries in the ground. The ground tans everything it keeps long enough. The eyes in those sockets were open. They were wet and they moved. They tracked the truck as it passed, and my father said that in the half-second he saw them, he understood that the face was dead, but that the eyes were not. That contradiction was the worst part. Something was looking out of that face that had no business being behind dead eyes, and it saw him clearly. And yet it was not surprised to see him there. He drove the remaining 6 miles without slowing down. His odometer recorded the distance as 9. He was past questioning this by then. At the Geddes farm, they opened the trailer. 14 of the 15 sheep walked out in good order. The 15th was at the back of the trailer, at the far corner, and it wasn't standing up. Now I must describe what my father described to me, and I'll do it plainly, though it is bizarre and disturbing. The ewe was on its side. It was definitely alive. My father could see its ribcage moving, shallow but rapid breathing. Its eyes were open, and its legs were making small rhythmic paddling motions, like a dying animal's legs moving as the nervous system fails. But the animal's not dying from any wound or impact. Well, nothing that made sense anyway. You see, its abdomen had been opened up. The skin and wool of the belly had been parted along a line so clean and straight, it looked measured, from the sternum to the pelvis, and the 2 flaps of skin had been folded back, laid flat against the ground on either side of the body, like the pages of some book. The interior of the animal was exposed. Organs, musculature, the architecture of a living sheep presented in cross-section, as though for a veterinary demonstration. The organs had been rearranged. The stomach and intestines, which should have been in the abdominal cavity, had been drawn out and placed on the exterior of the body in positions that corresponded roughly to where they would sit if the animal's inside and outside had been reversed. The liver was where the wool should have been. The wool was underneath. Everything was in the wrong place but arranged with intent. Something with horrible creativity had opened this animal up and tried to put it back together according to a different set of instructions. Somehow, the ewe was breathing through all of this. Its legs were still paddling. Its eye, the one my father could see, was open and looking at nothing. My father and Geddes stood at the back of that trailer in the dark farmyard with a single torch beam on the poor animal, and neither of them said a word. My father said they stood there for minutes, which feels like years when you're standing in silence looking at something impossible. Geddes then climbed into the trailer, cutting the ewe's throat with his penknife. The breathing stopped. The legs stopped. And that was that. They dragged the remains out of the trailer, burying them behind the farm buildings in the dark, working by torchlight. When the hole was filled and the ground stamped flat, Geddes stuck his spade in the earth, leaning on it, and said, "Don't bring any more animals down that damned road." My father explained that he still had one more trip. Geddes gave him a look and said, "My father used to haulage sheep before me, and his father before him. Nobody in my family drives after dark on the Moor Road, and I'd suggest you arrive at the same policy." He picked up his spade and walked away. My father drove home. He didn't sleep well that night. In fact, he first stayed in the kitchen in the dark with a cup of tea, sort of just listening to the house. He tried to find a way to make what he had seen fit into a normal world, but he failed to do so. The days after the third trip were the part of the story my father told with the least detail. I think this was not because nothing happened, but because what happened was personal. And even on his deathbed, there were things he didn't want to hand down to his son. He said he felt different, that food had lost its familiar taste. Even the reflection in the bathroom mirror seemed delayed or lagged by the smallest fraction of a second, but he could feel it. And he had dreams every night. The Moor Road, footsteps behind him, the walk that didn't end, and every morning, the boots were by the door with fresh peat on the soles. My mother noticed. She was not an easily frightened woman, but my father said she had begun watching him with a quality of attention associated with waiting rooms. Patient, alert, braced for any kind of news. One evening she told him he smelled different. He asked what she meant. She said she could not describe it, except that it wasn't him. The smell of his very skin had changed, and she looked afraid, likely because my father wasn't sick. And if he was, that would be treatable. This wasn't. Drummond eventually called. One more trip, the final batch. 15 ewes, finish the contract, finish the drove, and be done. My father said yes. Drummond's warning was the last thing my father heard before he pulled out of the farm track onto the B road for the final time. They'd loaded the 15 ewes in near silence, working quickly in the afternoon light, and as my father climbed into the cab, Drummond put his hand on the doorframe, and he held it there so that the door couldn't close. He looked my father dead in the eye, and he said, "Don't stop. Whatever you see on that road, don't stop the truck. If it stalls, you stay in the cab. Do not put your feet on that road after dark." My father asked what would happen if he did. Drummond took his hand off the doorframe and said, "Then you'll join the drove." He stepped back, and my father closed the door. That was the last time the two men spoke. It was 3:30 when he reached the B road. Sunset was at 4:30. 12 miles at 45 would take 16 minutes. He would be off the moor and through the cattle grid with daylight to spare. My father said he felt something close to optimism as he turned onto the single track, which tells you how far his calibration had shifted over the preceding weeks. That the prospect of driving a road that had mutilated livestock and put living eyes in a dead man's face could produce anything resembling relief. But he had daylight, and he had speed, and he had an engine that had never let him down. In 16 minutes, it should be over. The moor opened up on either side as the road climbed away from the glen. Brown peat, gray sky, hills on the horizon just visible through a thin haze. He set his speed at 45 and watched the odometer and drove. At mile 3, the sky changed. The overcast, which had been a uniform gray sheet all day, thickened and dropped. This man had driven through highland squalls and hill fog, even through horizontal rain so bad it reduced visibility to the length of the bonnet. But this was strange. The light simply left. No fade whatsoever. The light was simply removed. He checked his watch. 3:50. The sunset should not have been for another 40 minutes. The dark had come early, and it came all at once. There was nothing natural about this. He pressed his accelerator. The engine responded, but the truck felt heavy suddenly, sluggish, laboring, like it was having trouble pulling the additional weight of the trailer now. The temperature gauge, which normally sat comfortably in the middle third of its range, began to climb. He was doing 45 by the speedometer, but the sensation of speed was wrong too. The road ahead unspooled in his headlights at a pace that felt closer to 30. Mile 6. The halfway point on a 12-mile road, except by now he had no faith that that road was 12 miles. He drove and he watched the odometer count, and he kept his hands tight on the wheel. The sheep in the trailer stayed silent. He had been listening for them since the start of the drive, but he'd heard nothing. Over a dozen animals standing in a metal box in a moving vehicle eventually produced some sound, but these were producing nothing. It had been so completely quiet behind him that if he hadn't loaded them himself an hour earlier, he could have believed that the trailer was empty. Mile 9. No cattle grid. The moor road continued ahead of him, straight and featureless, the headlights reaching maybe 80 yards before the dark swallowed them. The temperature gauge was nudging the red. The engine note had changed from the steady diesel thrum that he knew as well as his heartbeat to something strained and arrhythmic, a machine working against a resistance which it was not designed for. He checked the wing mirror on the driver's side, a habit of his. A haulier does this every few minutes without thinking about it. There, in the red wash of the taillights, at the furthest edge of what the glow could reach, there were shapes on the road behind him. They were low and pale, moving in a loose formation that spread across the width of the road and the verges on either side. Sheep. There were sheep on the road behind his trailer, following him across the moor, and there were far more of them than the 15 he was carrying. He could see dozens. They filled the road from edge to edge and extended back beyond the reach of his taillights into a darkness that could have contained any number more. They were walking at the same pace as his truck, keeping a steady distance, and even in the dim red light and the small shaking rectangle of the wing mirror, he could see that they were not normal. Like that figure from before, they moved stiffly and uniformly, every animal moving in the same rhythm, legs working in lockstep that normal sheep would never do. Some of them were even walking on legs that were bent oddly, which would make it impossible for a living animal to stand on, let alone move with. One near the front of the flock, where the tail light was strongest, had its head hanging sideways from a clearly broken neck. The skull was resting against its own shoulder, and it walked the same steady pace as the rest. Their wool was dark and matted, with something that looked like mud but wasn't, and the ones closest to the light had a quality to their bodies that my father struggled to articulate that I will try to convey as precisely as I can. They looked compressed, flattened, as though they had been subject to enormous pressure that had pushed them into a denser version of themselves, the way peat pushes everything into a tighter, darker, more preserved form. My father faced forward and put his foot down. The engine screamed, the speedometer read 50, but that road was not meant for 50. The truck shuddered and swayed, and he held the wheel with both hands, determined to keep driving, due to what Drummond had told him, and because looking in that mirror again was something that he could not bring himself to do. Mile 14. There was no cattle grid still. The road should have ended 2 miles ago by any honest measurement, and it had not ended. The engine temperature was in the red, and the needle was still climbing. My father could smell hot metal and coolant, and he knew that the truck was about to die, and there was nothing he could do about it. It died at mile 15. Like a dying man's pulse, the engine stopped. Mid-beat, total, without the courtesy of a gradual failure. The truck rolled forward on its remaining momentum, slowing, and came to a rest on the empty road, with the headlights dimming to amber on battery power, and the dark closing in from every direction, like water filling a hole. He sat in the cab. He did not try the ignition. He knew the engine was gone, and he understood that turning the key would drain the battery faster, and the headlights were the only thing between him and absolute darkness. He wanted them for as long as they would last. The cab was cooling rapidly. The heater had died with the engine, and the November cold came in through the glass and the floor and the doors. Yet underneath that cold was the other cold, the one he'd felt on the moor road from the first trip. Wet and organic, carrying the smell of deep peat, the smell of ground full of dead things. In the wing mirror, the flock had stopped. They stood on the road behind the trailer in a dense, still mass, and in the fading taillight, they almost looked like ordinary sheep if you kept your focus soft and did not look too closely. My father did not examine them closely either. He glanced once, then he faced forward, placing his hands on the wheel as he waited. The flock parted. He heard that part rather than saw it. The sound of hooves on tarmac shifting to either side, pressing to the verges to open a path through their center. And through that center, at a pace that matched the mechanical rhythm of the flock's walking, came the sound of footsteps. Heavy steps, accompanied by a wet, dragging sound underneath, as though this new figure was leaving a trail on the road surface. The footsteps passed along the left side of the trailer, close enough that my father could hear the brush of the long coat against the metal sidewall. And then they were alongside the truck. Then they were alongside the cab, and then they stopped outside the driver's door. My father didn't look. He stared through the windshield at the last pale cone of his failing headlights on the empty road ahead. He kept his hands on the wheel, and he didn't turn his head. He could hear it, though. Hear it standing there inches from the glass, the sound of its breathing thin and papery. Beneath the breathing, he could hear other smaller sounds. The faint creak of the weight across its shoulders shifting, the slow drip of something landing on the tarmac below, the soft wet contact of the dead sheep's hooves swaying against the figure's chest. And it stood there for so long. But my father didn't count. He said that time lost its structure, because when you're in a situation like that, time loses its meaning. The only way he knew time was truly passing was the fact that the headlights were still getting dimmer, and that the cold was getting deeper. He gripped the wheel, and he did not look at it. He did not speak to it. He refused to move. Suddenly, the glass made a sound. A high and thin sound, like something hard being drawn down a smooth surface. My father kept his eyes forward, but he could see it in his peripheral vision. The movement on the driver's side window, the dark shape at the glass. The sound continued, a slow, downward stroke, from the top of the window to the bottom. Then another, parallel to the first, and another. 4 strokes altogether, 4 lines or grooves being inscribed into the exterior of the glass by something that was not a fingernail, and was not a tool, and was, as far as my father's peripheral vision could tell, the tip of a bare, dark, and hardened finger. The sound stopped. The breathing continued for a few more seconds, but then the footsteps resumed, moving past the cab, past the bonnet, and now onto the road ahead. The dragging sound went with it, and the flock on the verges began to move, falling in line behind the figure. The whole procession, the shepherd and his dead drove, walked north along the moor road until the sound of their passage faded and the night was silent. My father was alone. He waited, maybe 5 minutes. He could not have waited longer because his body was shaking with a violence that made it difficult to keep his hands on the wheel, and the cold had gotten into him, touching his very core. He turned the key, and the engine started right away, turning over on the first attempt with a healthy, steady note. It was like the dang thing had never stopped. The headlights brightened, the temperature gauge sat in the middle of its range, and the cab began to warm up. He put the truck in gear and drove. The cattle grid appeared less than 2 miles later, exactly where the map said it should be, and he crossed it, and the road dropped into the glen, and the moor was behind him. He did not look back. At the Geddes farm, the farmer had agreed to receive this final batch despite what he'd said before. My father never explained how that arrangement had been made. They opened the trailer. 14 sheep came out, healthy, uninjured, and calm. 14, not 15. The trailer was sealed, bolted from the outside. There was no gap or breach anywhere in its construction, nowhere for a 60-kilogram animal to leave through. 14 sheep walked into the pen, and the 15th simply did not exist. There was no body, no blood, no wool, and no hoofprint. There was no indication that a 15th animal had ever been in the trailer at all. Geddes counted twice, so did my father. 14. Geddes looked at my father across the pen gate, and my father looked back. Geddes took out his delivery book, signed the receipt for 15, and put the book away. He closed the pen and walked toward his house without turning around. My father drove home to Bewley in the dark with the heater on full and the radio playing. His hands were steady on the wheel and his mind was blank. He parked outside his house and sat in the cab for a while before finally going inside. He didn't check the trailer. He never checked that trailer again. He never drove that moor road again either. The contract was finished. Drummond never called, and my father never inquired. He learned years later and secondhand that Drummond had been found dead on the moor road in the spring of 1979. They found him sitting upright against a fence post with his crook across his lap, dead of exposure on a night when the temperature had not dropped below 7 degrees. The man who told my father about this said Drummond looked like he had been sitting there for a long time, though the pathologist report put the death at only a few hours before the body was found. My father received this information, said nothing, and changed the subject. Those changes my father dealt with, well, they faded. The dreams stopped within a month or so. The peat mud stopped appearing on his boots. The strange thing about his reflection even settled. My mother stopped watching him, and the smell she had noticed went away. By the time I was born in February of 1973, my father was, by all external measures, the same man he'd been before the contract. He went back to work. He hauled livestock for another 28 years, and he never spoke about what happened, never drove that road. But he was a different man. But because I grew up inside that difference, I wasn't able to name it myself. But I knew that he flinched at dead animals on the roadside. Not the typical grimace that you might make, but a full-body recoil, a jerk of the head away, as though the sight was physically painful. He wouldn't walk on unpaved ground after dark, which in the rural highlands is a significant constraint, and if circumstances forced it, he moved with a rigid, mechanical haste that I now recognize as a man trying to spend as little time as possible with his feet on open earth. He kept the radio on every waking hour in every room he occupied, a low and continuous murmur of voices and music that didn't really serve an entertainment purpose. He really didn't listen to it himself. It was just sound to fill the quiet, made him feel less alone. A few years after he died, I flew out to visit my mom, and I went to look at the truck. The Bedford was still in the barn where he'd parked it after his last job, covered in dust and pigeon droppings, but structurally intact. I opened the cab door and sat in the driver's seat. I mean, my father had spent more hours in that seat than in any chair in our house. There was something of him still in the worn vinyl, and the position of the mirrors, and the faint smell of diesel and livestock. I looked at the driver's side window. The scratches were still there. 4 vertical lines scored into the exterior surface, running from the top to the bottom, deep enough to catch a fingernail when I ran my hand across them on the outside. These weren't cracks. They weren't random marks of road debris or scraped branches. They were a warning, and they were proof that my dad's story was more true than I liked to believe. I feel like roads can be haunted like houses can be haunted, but one seems far worse. If you're trapped in a haunted house, you cover your head, you ignore the ghosts, and you wait for dawn. But a haunted road, well, you're at the mercy of the infinite darkness, my friend, and whatever lurks within it. Good night. Thank you all so much for tuning into this episode of Tales from the Break Room. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails. You can send me your scary work-related stories at eeriecast.com/submit. You can also find this show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or the YouTube channel, Darkness Prevails. Till next time, everyone, I've got to clock out, but I'll be back again real soon.